Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. The sun was setting over the vast expanse of the African bush as my brother and I set up camp for the night, the sounds of the wilderness echoing all around us. We had ventured deep into the heart of the bush, far from civilization, seeking adventure and the chance to connect with nature. But as darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, a sense of unease settled over us like a heavy blanket. The bush was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, their calls and cries echoing through the night, but there was something else out there, something darker and more sinister lurking in the shadows. We huddled around the campfire, our senses on high alert, as we listened to the sounds of the night. But as the hours passed and the darkness deepened, a new sound reached our ears, the distant crackle of gunfire, echoing through the stillness like a warning from the depths of the wilderness. Fear gripped my heart as I realized what we were hearing: poachers, ruthless men who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. We had stumbled upon their illegal activities, and now our lives were in grave danger. My brother and I exchanged a silent glance, our eyes wide with fear, as we realized the gravity of our situation. We were alone in the African bush, with no one to turn to for help, and the poachers were closing in on us with each passing moment. We knew we had to act fast if we were to have any hope of surviving the night. With trembling hands, we doused the campfire and gathered our belongings, moving quickly and quietly through the darkness, trying to put as much distance between ourselves and the poachers as possible. But no matter how fast we ran, the sound of gunfire grew louder and more menacing with each passing moment, drawing ever closer to our hiding place in the heart of the bush. Panic surged through my veins as I realized that we were being hunted, that the poachers were closing in on us with ruthless determination. We had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and our only hope of survival lay in outsmarting our pursuers and finding a way to escape the bush alive. We pressed on through the night, our hearts pounding in our chests as we navigated the treacherous terrain, our senses on high alert for any sign of danger. But as dawn broke over the horizon and the first light of morning pierced the darkness, we knew that we were running out of time. Exhausted and on the brink of collapse, we stumbled upon a small clearing in the bush, our breath coming in ragged gasps as we collapsed to the ground, our bodies battered and bruised from our harrowing ordeal. But as we lay there, gasping for breath and praying for deliverance, a miracle occurred at the sound of approaching voices, shouting and calling out to us in the distance. Relief flooded through me as I realized that we were saved by the timely arrival of a group of park rangers who had come to our rescue just in the nick of time. They led us to safety, their faces grim with determination as they explained the gravity of the situation. The poachers had been apprehended, their illegal activities brought to an end, and we were safe once more. As we emerged from the bush, blinking in the bright light of day, I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound gratitude for the park rangers who had saved our lives, and a newfound respect for the untamed wilderness of the African bush. The storm hit us hard about an hour into the ferry ride. The sky turned dark, and the waves started tossing the boat around like a toy. I was on the upper deck, trying to keep my balance while watching the water crash against the sides. It was supposed to be a routine trip across the bay, but this storm came out of nowhere. I decided to go inside and find a seat. The cabin was crowded with people trying to escape the weather. I found an empty spot near the back and sat down, wiping the rain off my face. The air was thick with the smell of wet clothes and anxiety. Everyone was nervous, and the storm wasn't helping. I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. Something about him seemed off. He kept glancing around, fidgeting with a small black bag on his lap. Every few minutes, he'd look at his watch and then back at the bag. It made me uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid because of the storm. But I couldn't stop watching him. He looked around again, and this time our eyes met. He quickly looked away, stuffing the bag under his seat. That's when I knew something wasn't right. I got up and moved closer, pretending to stretch my legs. From my new spot, I could see the bag better. It was partially open, and I caught a glimpse of wires and a small device inside. My heart started pounding. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I decided to find a crew member. I walked towards the front of the cabin, trying to act casual. I spotted a crew member near the entrance, talking to a couple of passengers. I waited until he was alone, then approached him. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice low. "I need to talk to you. It's important." He looked at me, eyebrows raised. "What's the matter?" "There's a man back there," I said, nodding towards the back of the cabin. "He has a bag with some kind of device in it. It looks dangerous." The crew member's expression changed. He glanced towards the back, then back at me. "Stay here," he said. "I'll take care of it." He walked away quickly, and I watched as he approached the man. The man saw him coming and grabbed the bag, standing up. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the man was shaking his head, trying to walk away. The crew member blocked his path, and that's when the man shoved him and started running. Panic erupted in the cabin. People were screaming and trying to get out of the way. I followed the man, pushing through the crowd. He ran down a narrow corridor, heading towards the lower deck. I didn't know what I was doing, but I couldn't let him get away. I caught up to him just as he reached the stairs. He turned and saw me, his eyes wide with fear and anger. He reached into the bag, and I saw the glint of a knife. I backed up, holding my hands up. "Stay back," he said, his voice shaking. "Just stay back." I didn't move. He turned and ran down the stairs, and I followed at a distance. The lower deck was mostly empty, and the sound of the storm was louder down here. I saw him disappear into a storage room, and I knew I had to act fast. I looked around and saw a fire extinguisher on the wall. I grabbed it and crept towards the storage room. I could hear him inside, rummaging through the bag. I took a deep breath and swung the door open, spraying the extinguisher at him. He shouted and dropped the bag, trying to shield himself. I charged at him, hitting him with the extinguisher. He fell to the ground, and I grabbed the bag, running out of the room. I didn't stop until I reached the upper deck, where I found the crew member I had talked to earlier. He took the bag from me and called for backup. Within minutes, more crew members arrived and restrained the man. They searched the bag and found a homemade explosive device. The police were called, and they took the man into custody when we reached the shore. The rest of the trip was a blur. I was shaken, but relieved that it was over. The crew thanked me for my help, and I was given a voucher for a free trip as a reward. But I knew I wouldn't be taking any more ferries for a long time. The memory of that man's eyes, the fear and anger in them, still haunts me. I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and acted before it was too late. I've been driving a taxi for about 10 years, mostly night shifts. It's quieter at night, fewer people, but you also get some strange ones. I thought I'd seen it all, until that night. It was around 2 a.m., a quiet Tuesday. I was parked near the downtown area, waiting for a fare. A well-dressed man flagged me down. He was in a suit, looked like a businessman. He got in and gave me an address. It was a remote location outside the city, but nothing too unusual. We drove in silence for a while. He didn't seem like he wanted to chat, so I kept my eyes on the road. About 15 minutes in, I noticed him fidgeting in the back seat. He was looking out the window, then back at me in the rearview mirror. Something about his eyes made me uneasy. As we got closer to the destination, he suddenly leaned forward. His voice changed, colder, and he told me to turn off the main road. I hesitated, and he leaned in closer, his breath on my neck. "Don't ask questions," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Just drive." I turned off the road as he instructed. We were now on a narrow, unpaved path surrounded by trees. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. The path seemed to go on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I glanced at the man in the rearview mirror. He was staring at me, a smirk on his face. After what felt like an eternity, he told me to stop. I pulled over, and he got out, gesturing for me to follow. I didn't want to, but I was too scared to refuse. He led me into the woods, and I could hear the crunch of leaves under our feet. The silence was deafening. We walked for a few minutes until we reached a small clearing. He stopped and turned to face me. "Give me your phone and your wallet," he demanded. I handed them over without hesitation. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine. "You're going to help me with something," he said, his eyes cold and empty. He pulled out a shovel from a nearby bush and threw it at my feet. "Dig," he ordered. My hands were shaking, but I started digging. The soil was hard, and the work was slow. He watched me, not saying a word. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a way out of this. After what felt like hours, I had dug a hole about 3 feet deep. He told me to stop, then walked over and looked into the hole. He seemed satisfied. "Get in," he said, and my heart nearly stopped. I thought this was it, that he was going to bury me alive. I hesitated, and he pulled out a gun. "Get in," he repeated, his voice deadly calm. I climbed into the hole, my mind screaming in terror. He looked down at me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull the trigger. But instead, he threw a bag into the hole. "Bury it," he said. I realized he wasn't planning to kill me, at least not yet. I quickly covered the bag with dirt, my hands moving frantically. When I was done, he told me to get out. I scrambled out of the hole, my body trembling. He made me fill the hole completely, then took the shovel and led me back to the car. We drove back to the main road in silence. My mind was racing, but I didn't dare say a word. When we reached the outskirts of the city, he told me to stop. He handed me my phone and wallet, then got out of the car. Before he closed the door, he leaned in and said, "If you tell anyone about this, I'll know." I drove off as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got back to the city, I pulled over and threw up. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I didn't go to the police. I was too scared. What if he was watching? What if he came back for me? I never picked up another fare in that area again. Every time I see a well-dressed man, I feel a pang of fear. I still drive a taxi, but I'm always looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's out there, watching, waiting. Hi, my name's Thomas and I work as a forest ranger, and there's this one time that I'll never forget. It was during a storm, one of those really bad ones that comes out of nowhere and hits you like a freight train. I was out on patrol, trying to make sure that everyone was safe and that no one was out there in the woods getting themselves into trouble. But then the storm hit, and it hit hard. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling like a banshee. I knew I had to get back to the station, to hunker down and ride out the storm until it passed. I made it back just in time, as the rain started to come down even harder. I locked up the station and hunkered down inside, trying to wait out the storm and hoping that no one would be stupid enough to be out there in weather like this. But then I heard it, a knock on the door. I thought I must have been hearing things at first, but then I heard it again, louder this time. I cautiously made my way over to the door, trying to see through the rain and the darkness. There was a man standing there, soaked to the bone and shivering from the cold. He claimed that he had been out hiking and had gotten lost in the storm. He said he was looking for shelter, somewhere to wait out the weather until he could find his way back to safety. I didn't know what to do at first, whether to let him in or to turn him away. But then I figured that he was just some poor guy who had gotten caught out in the storm, like so many others. So I opened the door and let him inside, trying to be a good Samaritan and help him out in his time of need. But as soon as he stepped inside, I knew that something wasn't right. There was something about him, something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. It was like he was sizing me up, like he was trying to figure out if I was a threat or not. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself that I was just being paranoid. But then he started asking me all sorts of strange questions, like how many people were out there in the woods, and if I had any weapons on me. It was like he was trying to gauge whether or not he could overpower me. I started to get really nervous, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I might be in danger. I didn't know what to do, whether to try and kick him out or to try and placate him until the storm passed. But then he made his move, lunging at me with a knife in his hand. I barely had time to react, scrambling backwards and trying to defend myself as best as I could. It was like something out of a nightmare, like I was trapped in some kind of horror movie. I managed to grab hold of a chair and swing it at him, knocking him off balance and giving me enough time to make a run for it. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the station, until I was sure that he couldn't follow me anymore. I called for help as soon as I could, telling them what had happened and begging them to come and get me. It felt like hours before they finally arrived, like I was trapped in some kind of endless nightmare. But eventually they found me, and they took me back to safety. I never found out what happened to that guy, whether they caught him or whether he managed to slip away into the night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night for as long as I live. It was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and it's something that I hope I never have to experience again. I decided to spend a few days in my family's beach house. I wanted some time alone, away from the chaos of the city. The weather forecast said there'd be a storm, but I didn't mind. I liked the sound of rain and waves crashing. It felt peaceful. The first night, the wind started picking up. By the time I went to bed, the rain was hitting the windows hard. I could hear the ocean roaring. I pulled the covers up and tried to sleep, but the storm kept me awake. Around midnight, I heard a loud crash outside. I got up and looked out the window. Through the sheets of rain, I saw a small boat had washed ashore. 2 men were stumbling out of it. They looked soaked and desperate. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to help, but another part was cautious. I decided to go downstairs and see what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the back door. The wind almost knocked me over. The men saw my light and started waving. "Please, we need help," one of them shouted. I couldn't hear him well over the storm, but his voice sounded desperate. I waved them over. They ran to the house, shivering and soaked. I let them in and shut the door behind them. "Thank you," one of them said, catching his breath. "Our boat got caught in the storm." "Do you have a phone we can use?" the other man asked. "No service out here," I said. "But you can dry off and warm up inside." They nodded, looking around the house. Something about their gaze made me uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. I got them some towels and let them dry off by the fireplace. As they warmed up, I asked them what happened. "We were out fishing," the first man said. "Got caught in the storm and couldn't make it back." "Yeah," the other man added, "then our boat hit something and started sinking. We barely made it to shore." I nodded, but something felt off. Their story seemed too simple. They were looking around the house too much, like they were casing the place. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep things calm. "I'm Mike, and this is Jeff," the first man said. "I'm Chris," I replied. "You're welcome to stay until the storm passes." They thanked me again, but the tension was thick. I offered them some dry clothes and food. As they changed, I noticed they both had tattoos that looked like prison ink. My unease grew. We sat in the living room, the storm raging outside. I tried to make small talk, but they were evasive. They kept glancing at each other, like they were silently communicating. I excused myself to go to the bathroom. I needed to think. Something wasn't right. I decided to call the local police station. There was a landline in the house, and I hoped it still worked. As I dialed, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mike standing in the doorway, watching me. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone cold. "Just checking on something," I lied, hanging up the phone. Mike's eyes narrowed. "You're not calling anyone, are you?" No, I said quickly. "Just checking if the phone works." He didn't look convinced, but stepped back. I knew I had to be careful. I went back to the living room, trying to act normal. Jeff was looking through the kitchen cabinets. "Got any booze?" he asked. "No, sorry," I said. "Just water and soda." He grunted, clearly annoyed. The atmosphere was getting worse. I could feel their hostility growing. The storm outside was relentless. It felt like it would never end. I needed to find a way to get these guys out of my house. I decided to try and reason with them. "Look," I said, trying to sound calm. "You're welcome to stay until the storm passes, but I need to know you're not going to cause any trouble." Mike and Jeff exchanged glances again. Mike smirked. "We're not here to cause trouble. Just needed a place to stay." His tone was sarcastic, almost mocking. I didn't believe him. I needed a plan. I decided to try and get them to leave voluntarily. "If you're not comfortable here, there's a small town a few miles down the road," I said. "They might have a place you can stay." Jeff laughed. "You really think we're going out in this storm?" I felt trapped. The tension was thick, and I knew I had to be careful. I decided to try and keep them distracted until the storm passed. I suggested we play a game to pass the time. They agreed, but their interest seemed fake. As we played, I kept thinking about how to get out of this situation. I needed to stay alert and ready to act if things went south. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Suddenly, Mike stood up. "I need to check something outside." I felt a surge of panic. "What do you need to check?" "Just something with the boat," he said, heading for the door. I knew I couldn't let him go alone. "I'll come with you," I said. He turned, a cold look in his eyes. "No need. Stay here." I followed him anyway, grabbing my flashlight. As we stepped outside, the wind almost knocked us over. I could barely see through the rain, but I followed Mike to the boat. When we reached it, he turned to me. "Why are you really out here?" "I told you, I wanted to help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, his expression menacing. "I don't believe you." Before I could react, he lunged at me. I dodged, the flashlight slipping from my hand. We grappled in the mud, the storm raging around us. I managed to push him off and ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me. Jeff was waiting inside, his expression cold. "Where's Mike?" "He's staying with the boat," I lied, trying to catch my breath. Jeff didn't look convinced. "You're hiding something." I needed to act fast. "We should wait for the storm to pass, then you can both leave." Jeff's eyes narrowed. "We're not going anywhere." I knew I had to get help. I moved towards the phone, but Jeff blocked my way. "You're not calling anyone," he said, his voice low and threatening. I felt a surge of fear. These men were dangerous, and I was trapped. I needed a plan. I decided to try and lure Jeff outside, away from the phone. "I think there's something wrong with the boat," I said, trying to sound convincing. "Mike might need help." Jeff hesitated, then nodded. "Let's go." I followed him outside, my heart pounding. As we neared the boat, I saw Mike struggling in the mud, trying to get up. Jeff rushed to help him, and I took my chance. I ran back to the house, grabbed the phone, and dialed the local police. My hands were shaking, but I managed to explain the situation. They said they'd send someone right away. I locked the doors and waited, my heart racing. I knew it was only a matter of time before Mike and Jeff came back. I needed to stay hidden until help arrived. I heard footsteps on the porch, followed by banging on the door. "Let us in," Mike shouted. I stayed silent, hiding in a closet. The banging grew louder, more desperate. I heard the sound of glass breaking, and knew they were inside. I held my breath, trying to stay calm. The minutes felt like hours. I prayed the police would arrive soon. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance. Mike and Jeff stopped searching, their footsteps growing frantic. They knew their time was up. The police arrived, bursting through the door. They found me hiding, and quickly apprehended Mike and Jeff. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers took my statement and assured me I was safe. Mike and Jeff were taken into custody, their plans thwarted. I spent the rest of the night at the police station, grateful to be alive. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. I had taken a small boat to one of the tiny, uninhabited islands off the coast of Maine. I had planned to fish, read, and just enjoy the solitude. The island was perfect, isolated, with a small beach and a dense forest in the middle. I set up my tent near the beach, got a fire going, and spent the day fishing and exploring. By late afternoon, the weather had turned. Dark clouds gathered, and the wind picked up. I decided to call it a day and headed back to my camp. As I was securing my gear, I noticed a boat approaching the island. It seemed odd because this island was pretty far from the main coastline, and I hadn't seen any other boats all day. 3 men got off the boat. They waved and walked over. They were dressed like fishermen, with weathered faces and rough clothes. They introduced themselves, Tom, Bill, and Eddie, and said they were out fishing and had seen my campfire. They asked if they could join me for a bit to wait out the weather. It seemed harmless enough, so I agreed. We sat around the fire, and they shared some of their catch. They seemed friendly at first, asking about my trip and what I did for a living. But as the evening wore on, their questions became more personal, and their demeanor started to change. They asked why I was out here alone, if anyone knew I was here, if I had a family waiting for me back home. Tom, the apparent leader, began talking about the island in a way that made me uncomfortable. He mentioned how easy it would be for someone to disappear out here, how nobody would hear a scream over the wind and waves. His tone was light, almost joking, but there was an edge to it that set off alarm bells in my head. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but it was clear something was off. Bill and Eddie kept glancing at each other, then at me. The atmosphere grew tense, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I decided it was time to end the evening. I thanked them for their company and suggested they head back to their boat before the storm hit. Tom laughed, a harsh, mocking sound, and said they weren't in a hurry. He stood up, towering over me, and said they had nowhere else to be tonight. His eyes were cold, and his smile didn't reach them. Bill and Eddie stood up too, flanking him, their expressions unreadable but menacing. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I was in trouble. I tried to stay calm and told them I was tired and needed to get some sleep. Tom shook his head, still smiling that cold smile, and said they weren't done talking. He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed up, feeling the heat of the fire on my legs. Then, without warning, Eddie lunged at me. I dodged and ran toward the tent, but Bill grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. I struggled, kicked, and managed to break free. I sprinted into the forest, my only thought to get away, to hide. The wind howled through the trees, and rain started to pour down, turning the ground to mud. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, shouting angrily. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots tripping me. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, tasting dirt and blood. I scrambled up, heart pounding, lungs burning, and kept running. I found a small hollow under an old tree and squeezed myself into it, trying to make as little noise as possible. I could hear them nearby, their voices raised, cursing and calling for me. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. The minutes dragged by, each one an eternity. The rain pounded down, masking some of the noise but not enough to drown out their voices. Eventually, their voices faded, and I dared to breathe again. I waited, shivering and soaked to the bone, until I was sure they were gone. Slowly, I crawled out and made my way back to the camp, staying low and quiet. The fire had died down, and the camp was empty. Their boat was still there, but there was no sign of the men. I grabbed my pack and slipped down to the beach, heading for the boat. If I could get to the mainland, I could find help. I pushed the boat into the water and climbed in, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the oars. I rowed with all my strength, the muscles in my arms burning, my mind filled with the fear that they would hear me, that they would come back and finish what they started. The storm made the crossing treacherous, but I didn't care. I kept rowing until I could see the lights of the mainland. I stumbled onto the shore, exhausted and terrified, and found a small diner still open. I called the police, and they came quickly, taking my statement and searching the island. They found the campsite, but the men were gone, leaving no trace behind. I never found out who they were or what they really wanted. The police said I was lucky to be alive, and I knew they were right. I haven't been back to that island or any other since. We were on a road trip, just my wife, our 2 kids, and me. It was supposed to be a fun family vacation, driving through the countryside and stopping in motels along the way. We were on our way to visit some relatives we hadn't seen in a while. Everything was going great until that night. We pulled into a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was the only place around for miles, and it was getting late. The sign flickered, and the paint was peeling off the walls, but we were tired and just needed a place to sleep. The manager was an older man, friendly enough, who gave us a room key with a smile. Room 12. Our room was at the end of a long hallway. It smelled a bit musty, but it seemed clean enough. The kids were excited, jumping on the beds while my wife and I unpacked. After a quick dinner of takeout, we settled in for the night. I turned on the TV, trying to find something for the kids to watch while my wife got ready for bed. Around 10 p.m., we heard a knock at the door. I thought it was odd, but maybe it was the manager checking if we needed anything. I opened the door a crack, and before I knew it, 3 men barged in, pushing me back. They had guns and were shouting, telling us to be quiet and not to move. My heart was pounding. One of the men grabbed my wife and pushed her onto the bed with the kids. The other 2 forced me into a chair and tied my hands behind my back. My kids were crying, and my wife was trying to comfort them while keeping herself calm. The men were dressed in dark clothes, their faces covered with ski masks. They looked desperate and dangerous. "We're not here to hurt you," one of them said, though his voice didn't reassure me. "We just need a place to lay low for a while. Do as we say, and you'll be fine." The leader, the one who had spoken, seemed the most level-headed. He kept glancing at his watch and out the window. The other 2 were more jittery, pacing back and forth. They kept the guns trained on us, watching our every move. We sat there for what felt like hours, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a way to get my family out of this alive. I could hear my kids whispering, scared, asking my wife what was going on. She kept telling them it would be okay, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I tried to talk to the men, to reason with them. "Please, we won't cause any trouble. Just let my family go, and you can stay here." The leader looked at me, considering. "Shut up," he finally said. "You're not in a position to make demands." Time dragged on. The men were getting more nervous. They talked among themselves in low voices, making plans. I caught bits and pieces about a getaway car and meeting someone. They were waiting for someone to come get them. I realized then that they weren't just hiding out, they were on the run. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit there and hope they'd let us go. I started to work on the knots binding my wrists, trying to loosen them without drawing attention. My wife noticed and gave me a subtle nod, understanding what I was trying to do. Suddenly, there was a noise outside. The men tensed up, their guns aimed at the door. The leader motioned for us to be quiet, and we all held our breath. There was a knock, and then a voice calling out. It was the motel manager. "Everything okay in there?" he called. "Just doing a check." The leader swore under his breath and motioned for one of the other men to open the door. The manager's eyes widened when he saw the guns and us tied up. Before he could react, the man at the door grabbed him and pulled him inside. The situation was getting worse. The manager was now a hostage too, tied up next to me. The men were arguing, their nerves fraying. I knew we had to act soon or things could get deadly. I finally got my wrists free. I kept my hands behind my back, waiting for the right moment. The men were distracted, yelling at each other about what to do next. I glanced at my wife and gave her a look, hoping she'd understand. In a split second, I jumped up and tackled the nearest man, wrestling for his gun. My wife grabbed a lamp and swung it at another, hitting him on the head. The kids were screaming, and chaos erupted in the small room. The man I tackled was strong, but I was fighting for my family's life. I managed to get the gun and pointed at him. "Drop it," I shouted. "Everybody, drop it." The men hesitated, but seeing the gun in my hand, they slowly put their weapons down. The leader cursed and glared at me, but they complied. I kept the gun trained on them while my wife untied the manager and the kids. We backed out of the room, the manager leading us to the office where he called the police. The men didn't follow. They knew they were caught. The police arrived quickly, surrounding the motel and arresting the 3 men. They were wanted for a string of robberies and had been on the run for days. They'd chosen our room by chance, a random act that could have ended tragically. We were shaken but safe. The manager apologized repeatedly, offering us a free stay, but we declined. We just wanted to get out of there, away from the nightmare. We drove to a nearby town and found another motel, one with better security. That night, none of us slept well. The kids had nightmares, and my wife and I stayed up, holding each other and thanking our luck. It was a trip we'd never forget, but for all the wrong reasons. I checked into a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town. I had been driving for hours and needed a place to rest. The man at the front desk, who introduced himself as Bob, seemed overly friendly. He asked a lot of questions about where I was coming from and where I was going. It felt strange, but I brushed it off as small talk. After checking in, I took my bags to my room. It was dingy and smelled a bit musty, but I was too tired to care. I put my things down and lay on the bed, thinking about the money I was carrying. I had sold my car earlier that day and had the cash in my bag. It was a lot of money, and I felt uneasy carrying it around, but I had no choice until I could deposit it the next morning. As I settled in, there was a knock on my door. It was Bob. He said he just wanted to make sure everything was all right with the room. I assured him it was fine, and he left, but not before glancing around the room in a way that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was too interested in me. I tried to relax and watch some TV, but I kept hearing footsteps outside my room. At one point, I looked through the peephole and saw another staff member, a woman, standing there. She seemed to be listening at my door. When she noticed me looking, she quickly walked away. My unease grew, and I decided to keep my door locked and stay alert. I thought about calling someone, but it was late, and I didn't want to alarm anyone without good reason. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but my gut told me something was off. Around midnight, I heard voices outside my room again. This time, it was Bob and the woman, talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone was serious. I quietly moved closer to the door to listen better. "She's got a lot of cash," Bob said. "Saw it when she checked in. We need to move fast." My heart started pounding. They were planning to rob me. I needed to get out of there, but I had to be smart about it. I quickly gathered my things, making as little noise as possible. I remembered there was a back door near my room that led to the parking lot. It was my best chance to escape without running into them. I carefully opened my door and peeked out. The hallway was empty. I slipped out and headed towards the back door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my keys. I finally got to the door and pushed it open, stepping into the cool night air. I hurried to my car, glancing over my shoulder. Bob and the woman hadn't noticed I was gone yet. I threw my bags in the back seat and got in, starting the engine as quietly as I could. Just as I was about to pull away, I saw Bob and the woman burst out the back door, looking around frantically. I floored it, speeding out of the parking lot and down the road. My heart was racing, and I kept checking my rearview mirror to make sure they weren't following me. I drove until I found a well-lit gas station, where I pulled over and took a moment to collect myself. I called the police and told them everything that had happened. They said they would send a patrol car to the motel to investigate. I waited at the gas station, feeling a mix of fear and relief. After a while, an officer called me back and said they had detained Bob and the woman for questioning. They found evidence that suggested they had done this before to other guests. I eventually found another motel and checked in, making sure it was a reputable place this time. I couldn't sleep much that night, still shaken from the experience. The next morning, I went to the bank and deposited the money, feeling a huge weight lift off my shoulders. Looking back, I'm grateful I trusted my instincts. It was a terrifying experience, but I got out safe. I learned to be more cautious and to always trust my gut feeling. I never want to go through something like that again. I was driving alone in the outskirts of Las Vegas, the city lights fading behind me as I headed towards the empty desert. The road stretched out ahead, dark and desolate, with nothing but the occasional cactus and tumbleweed for company. It was late, and I was tired, but I wanted to make it to my destination before calling it a night. As I drove, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another traveler on the road. But then the car got closer, tailgating me and flashing its high beams. I frowned, wondering why they were driving so aggressively. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road ahead. But the car didn't let up, swerving dangerously close to my bumper and then falling back again. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach, realizing that this was no ordinary driver. They were deliberately trying to intimidate me. I sped up, hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed, staying right on my tail. Panic surged through me as I realized they weren't going to give up easily. I had to do something before they caused an accident. I glanced at my phone, debating whether to call the police. But I didn't want to take my eyes off the road for even a second. Instead, I focused on staying calm and getting away from the other car. I saw it turn off up ahead, a narrow dirt road leading into the desert. Without thinking, I veered off the highway and onto the rough terrain. The car followed, its headlights bobbing over the bumps and dips in the road. I pushed my car to its limits, weaving through the desert landscape in a desperate attempt to escape. But no matter how fast I drove or how many twists and turns I made, the other car stayed right behind me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the driver's face, illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights. They were wearing a ski mask, their eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just trying to scare me, they meant to do me harm. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized I was in a fight for my life. I had to outsmart my pursuer and find a way to get help. But out here in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles, that seemed like an impossible task. I spotted a cluster of rocks up ahead, a potential hiding spot where I could make a stand. I slowed down, waiting until the last possible moment before swerving off the road and ducking behind the boulders. The other car screeched to a halt behind me, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. I held my breath, waiting for them to find me. But seconds ticked by, and there was no sign of movement. I risked a glance around the edge of the rock, my heart pounding in my chest. The other car was parked a few yards away, its engine idling. But there was no sign of the driver. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, they would find me, and then I would be defenseless. I had to come up with a plan, and fast. I reached into the glove compartment and grabbed a flashlight, flicking it on and shining it towards the other car. I didn't see anyone inside, but that didn't mean they weren't out there, waiting for me to make a move. I took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the rocks, keeping the flashlight trained on the other car. I moved slowly, my senses on high alert, ready for anything. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, the crunch of gravel underfoot. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw them, the driver, emerging from the shadows with a knife in their hand. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. But before I could react, they lunged at me, the glint of the blade flashing in the moonlight. Instinct took over, and I dodged out of the way, feeling the rush of air as the knife sliced through the space where I had been standing. Adrenaline surged through me as I fought back, swinging the flashlight like a weapon and aiming for their head. There was a sickening thud as the flashlight connected with their skull, and they stumbled backwards, dazed. I didn't hesitate. I ran, my feet pounding against the hard desert ground as I sprinted towards my car. I could hear them behind me, cursing and shouting threats. But I didn't look back. I reached my car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of the dirt road, leaving the other car and its driver far behind me. As I drove, my hand shook on the wheel, and tears streamed down my face. But I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the nearest town, where I called the police and reported what had happened. They promised to investigate, but I knew it would be hard to find someone in the vast expanse of the desert. I never found out who was chasing me that night, or why they had targeted me. But I'll never forget the terror I felt as I fought for my life in the middle of the desert, with no one around to help. I was working the night shift as a security guard at an abandoned amusement park. It was a lonely job, but it paid the bills. The park had been closed for years, but there were still occasional trespassers who thought it would be fun to explore the empty rides and attractions. That night, a storm was raging outside, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows of my small office. The sound of the storm was eerie, echoing through the empty corridors of the park like the ghostly laughter of long-dead children. I was making my rounds, checking the perimeter of the park to make sure no one had breached the fence, when I saw them. A group of figures huddled together near the entrance, their faces obscured by the hooded jackets they wore against the rain. I approached them cautiously, my hand resting on the nightstick at my belt. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound authoritative. "You're not supposed to be here. This place is off limits." The figures turned to face me, and I could see the glint of metal in their hands. My heart sank as I realized they were armed. I took a step back, my pulse racing with fear. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for the radio on my belt. But before I could make the call, one of the figures lunged at me, swinging a metal pipe in a wide arc. I stumbled backward, barely dodging the blow, and felt a sharp pain as the pipe grazed my shoulder. Adrenaline surged through me as I realized I was in real danger. These people weren't just trespassers, they were dangerous criminals. I had to get out of there, fast. I turned and ran, sprinting through the empty corridors of the park, the sound of their footsteps echoing behind me. The storm outside was raging, the wind howling like a pack of hungry wolves, but I didn't dare stop to catch my breath. I ducked into a nearby building, hoping to find shelter from the storm and a place to hide from my pursuers. But as I looked around, I realized with horror that I had stumbled into the park's old haunted house attraction. The air was thick with dust and cobwebs, and the sound of creaking floorboards echoed through the darkness. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I realized I was completely alone, trapped in the abandoned building with no way out. I stumbled through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, searching desperately for a way to escape. But every door I tried was locked tight, and the windows were boarded up, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world. I could hear them getting closer, their footsteps growing louder and more menacing with each passing moment. I knew I had to find a way out, or I would be at their mercy. Suddenly, I saw a glimmer of light up ahead, a small crack in the wall that led to the outside. I rushed toward it, my heart racing with hope, and squeezed through the opening just as the sound of footsteps reached a fever pitch behind me. I stumbled out into the storm, the rain pelting against my face like icy needles. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car, and even then, I didn't dare to look back. I drove away from the abandoned amusement park as fast as I could, my heart still pounding in my chest. It was a typical night at the nursing home where I worked. I was on the night shift, tasked with keeping an eye on the patients and ensuring they were comfortable throughout the night. Everything seemed quiet and peaceful, just like any other night. But then I noticed something strange, a new face among the visitors. He seemed out of place, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something. I watched him closely, trying to figure out what he was up to. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about him. He lingered near the patients' rooms, his attention focused on them in a way that made my skin crawl. I decided to keep a closer eye on him, discreetly following him as he moved through the halls. That's when I saw him slip into one of the patients' rooms, his movements quick and furtive. I rushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest as I confronted him. He tried to play it off, claiming he was just checking on the patient, but I knew better. I demanded to know what he was really doing there, and that's when he pulled out a vial of medication, one that belonged to one of the patients. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. He was stealing their medication, likely to sell it on the street for a profit. I couldn't believe someone would stoop so low, preying on the vulnerable residents of the nursing home. I tried to stop him, but he was too quick. He shoved me aside and bolted for the door, disappearing into the night before I could catch him. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let him get away with what he had done. I called the police and reported the theft, giving them a description of the man and what had happened. They arrived quickly, and I led them through the nursing home, pointing out the rooms he had been in and the medications he had stolen. We searched the building from top to bottom, but there was no sign of him. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as I realized he had gotten away. But I refused to give up hope. I knew we would catch him eventually, and when we did, he would face the consequences for his actions. In the meantime, I made sure to keep a closer eye on the patients and their medications, determined to prevent anything like this from happening again. I had been working the graveyard shift at the diner for about 6 months. The hours were long and the pay wasn't great, but it was a job. The place was usually quiet at night, mostly truckers and night owls stopping by for a quick meal. I liked the solitude and the routine. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 a.m., when a group of 5 men walked in. They were loud, laughing and talking in hushed tones that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They looked out of place, dressed too nicely for our little diner. I put on my best smile and walked over to their table with a notepad. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get for you?" I asked. They barely glanced at the menu. "Coffee, and keep it coming," one of them said. His voice was sharp, commanding. The others nodded in agreement. I poured their coffee and went back to the counter, keeping an eye on them. They seemed restless, looking around the diner as if expecting someone. The atmosphere felt tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, they started to get more aggressive. They laughed louder, made crude jokes, and began harassing the other customers. A couple at a nearby table tried to ignore them, but the men wouldn't leave them alone. One of the men, the one who had ordered the coffee, got up and walked over to the couple. "You two having a nice night?" he asked, his tone mocking. The couple looked uncomfortable, and the man put his arm around the woman, pulling her closer. I knew I had to do something. I walked over and tried to intervene. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave them alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, a cold smile on his face. "Or what?" he asked, taking a step closer. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Or I'll call the police," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. He laughed. "Go ahead. I'd love to see them try and do something about it." The other men at the table laughed too, egging him on. I backed away, my heart pounding. I went to the counter and picked up the phone, dialing 911. As the phone rang, I saw one of the men stand up and walk towards me. I turned away, hoping the police would answer quickly. 911, what's your emergency? The operator said. I spoke quickly, trying to keep my voice low. I'm at the diner on Route 5. There's a group of men here harassing customers. I need help. The man was getting closer. I turned to face him, holding the phone tightly. Put the phone down, he said, his voice cold. I did as he said, my hands shaking. The operator was still on the line, but I couldn't speak. The man leaned over the counter, his face inches from mine. You're making a big mistake, he said. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. He stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked back to his table. I picked up the phone again, whispering to the operator. Please hurry. The men continued their harassment, and I tried to keep the other customers calm. The couple eventually left, clearly frightened. It was just me and the group of men now. One of them got up and walked over to the jukebox, putting on some loud, thumping music. They started to dance, their movements erratic and wild. I stood behind the counter, watching them and praying the police would arrive soon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car outside. The men didn't seem to notice. I ran to the door and waved the officers in. They walked in, and the mood in the diner shifted instantly. The men stopped dancing and turned to face the officers. Is there a problem here? One of the officers asked. The man who had threatened me earlier stepped forward. No problem, officer. We're just having a good time. The officer looked at me, and I nodded slightly, letting him know that wasn't true. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, the officer said. The men grumbled but didn't argue. They slowly made their way out of the diner, throwing dirty looks over their shoulders. As soon as they were gone, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers stayed for a while, making sure everything was okay. I thanked them profusely, my hands still shaking. They told me to call if anything like that ever happened again and left. I sat down at the counter, trying to calm my nerves. The diner was quiet again, but the tension lingered in the air. I stayed on edge for the rest of my shift, jumping at every little noise. The night dragged on, and I couldn't wait for the morning to come. When my replacement finally arrived, I was exhausted but relieved. I told her what had happened, and she gave me a sympathetic look. You did the right thing, she said. I'm glad you're okay. I nodded, still feeling uneasy. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the men and how quickly things had escalated. I hoped I'd never have to deal with something like that again. The quiet of the night shift was no longer comforting. It was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. When I got home, I collapsed into bed, too tired to even eat. I lay there in the dark, replaying the events of the night in my mind. I knew I'd never forget the look in that man's eyes or the way my heart had pounded in my chest. The graveyard shift would never feel the same again. I was staying at this old fishing cabin for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a relaxing time, just me and the sound of the rain on the roof. But then the storm hit, and everything changed. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard it. A scream, loud and piercing, cutting through the sound of the rain. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, trying to see through the darkness and the rain. And that's when I saw her, stumbling out of the trees, her clothes torn and her face covered in dirt. She was crying and shaking, her whole body trembling with fear. I ran over to her, asking her what happened, if she was okay. She told me she had escaped from a kidnapper, that he had been holding her captive in the woods. I didn't know what to do, how to help her. I was just a regular guy, not some kind of hero. But I knew I couldn't just leave her out there in the storm, alone and terrified. So I brought her inside the cabin, trying to calm her down and make her feel safe. I gave her some dry clothes and a blanket, trying to warm her up from the cold. As she sat there, trembling and sobbing, she told me her story. She said she had been out for a walk in the woods when a man had grabbed her from behind, dragging her into his car and driving off into the night. She said she had been trapped in his cabin for days, locked away in a dark room with no way out. I felt sick to my stomach, imagining what she must have gone through. I couldn't believe that something like that could happen, not out here in the middle of nowhere. But then again, I guess you never really know what people are capable of. I wanted to call the police, to get her help right away. But then she begged me not to, saying that he would come looking for her, that he would never stop until he found her. I didn't know what to do, torn between wanting to help her and wanting to protect myself. And then, just as I was trying to figure out what to do next, I heard it. A car pulling up outside, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I realized that he had found her, that he was here to take her back. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a fireplace poker, and stood there in the darkness, waiting for him to come inside. I didn't know if I could take him on, if I could protect her from whatever he had planned. But then the car drove off again, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had come. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling the tension drain from my body as I realized that we were safe, at least for now. I stayed up all night, keeping watch over her as she slept, afraid that he would come back. But he never did. And when morning came, I drove her into town, to the nearest police station, where she could get the help she needed. I never found out what happened to her after that, if they caught the guy or if she ever got justice for what he did to her. But I like to think that she did, that she was able to move on with her life and leave the nightmare behind her. As for me, well, I never went back to that fishing cabin again. The memories were too painful, too haunting. But I'll never forget the terror of that night, the fear of not knowing if we would make it out alive. And I'll always be grateful that we did. I decided to explore a cave in the Appalachian Mountains. I had always been into hiking and exploring, and this was supposed to be an exciting adventure. I'd heard about this cave from a local, who said it was off the beaten path and not many people knew about it. That sounded perfect to me. The hike to the cave took most of the morning. The path was narrow and winding, and I had to climb over rocks and fallen trees. By the time I reached the entrance, I was tired but eager to explore. The cave mouth was wide, and I could feel the cool air coming out of it. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cave was bigger than I expected. The walls were damp, and the ground was uneven. I moved slowly, watching my step. The air was cool, and it smelled like earth and moss. The deeper I went, the darker it got, and soon the only light was from my flashlight. I felt a sense of excitement and a bit of fear, too. It was just me in the cave. I had been inside for about an hour when I heard voices. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard them again, clearer this time. Men's voices echoing through the tunnels. I froze, my heart pounding. Who would be down here? I turned off my flashlight, not wanting to be seen. The darkness was complete, and I felt my way to the wall, pressing against it. The voices were getting closer. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. As they got nearer, I could hear the clinking of metal and the thud of footsteps. I peeked around the corner and saw them. There were 3 men, all armed. They had flashlights and were carrying bags. They looked rough, like they had been hiding out for a while. I realized I had stumbled onto something dangerous. These men weren't just explorers like me. They were using the cave as a hideout. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't let them see me. I waited until they moved past, then slowly started to backtrack. My heart was racing, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see them following me. I moved as quietly as I could, but every sound seemed magnified in the silence of the cave. I was almost to the entrance when I heard a shout behind me. They had noticed something was off. I broke into a run, not caring about the noise anymore. The entrance was in sight, but I heard them coming after me. Their footsteps echoed, getting louder and closer. I burst out of the cave and into the daylight, my eyes struggling to adjust after the darkness. I didn't stop running. I headed down the mountain, stumbling over rocks and roots. I could hear them behind me, yelling at each other. They were fast, and I knew I had to find a place to hide. I spotted a thicket of bushes and dove into it, crouching down and trying to control my breathing. The men ran past, still shouting. I stayed hidden, not daring to move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. After a few minutes, their voices faded, but I didn't come out right away. I waited, making sure they were really gone. When I finally crawled out of the bushes, I was scratched and covered in dirt, but I was alive. I needed to get back to town and tell someone what I'd seen. I started moving again, this time more carefully. I didn't want to run into them on the way down. It took me a few hours to reach the trailhead. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting them to jump out at me. When I got to my car, I didn't waste any time. I drove straight to the nearest town and found the police station. I told them everything, about the cave and the men. They listened and took notes, then said they would check it out. They thanked me and told me to stay in town until they had investigated. I agreed, too shaken to argue. That night, I stayed in a motel, unable to sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, wondering how close I had come to being caught. The next day, the police told me they had found the cave and the men, who were wanted for several crimes. They had been using the cave as a hideout for weeks. Knowing they were caught helped me feel a bit safer, but the experience stayed with me. I had always loved exploring, but now I was more cautious. I still hiked, but I stayed on well-known trails and avoided going off alone. The mountains, which had once seemed so inviting, now felt a bit more dangerous. But I learned a lot from that experience. I learned to trust my instincts and to be aware of my surroundings. And I learned that even in the most beautiful places, danger can be lurking. I never went back to that cave, and I never told anyone else about it. The memory was enough, and the lesson it taught me was one I wouldn't forget. It's a big world out there, and not everything in it is safe. But with caution and awareness, I knew I could still find the beauty without putting myself in harm's way again. I was driving home late from a party in Florida. The roads were pretty empty, and it was just me and the long stretch of highway ahead. The night was dark, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the blackness. I felt a bit uneasy, but I just wanted to get home. After a while, I noticed a car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I realized it had been following me for miles. Every turn I took, every lane change, the car stayed right behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But then the car started flashing its lights at me. Bright and blinding, over and over. It wasn't a friendly signal, it felt aggressive. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my heart starting to race. I sped up a little, hoping they would pass me or turn off, but they didn't. They stayed right on my tail, flashing their lights. I glanced at my phone on the passenger seat, thinking about calling for help, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the road. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe they needed help or were trying to warn me about something. But deep down, I felt something was very wrong. The car sped up and got even closer, almost touching my bumper. I could see the outline of the driver in my rearview mirror, but it was too dark to make out any details. They were trying to force me off the road. Panic set in. I couldn't pull over. I had to keep moving. I remembered a gas station a few miles ahead and decided to head there, hoping it would be open and I could find some help. I kept my speed steady, trying not to let them see how scared I was. The car kept flashing its lights, getting more aggressive. As I neared the gas station, I felt a bit of relief. But then, just as I was about to turn into the lot, the car swerved, cutting me off and forcing me to miss the turn. I had to keep going straight, deeper into the dark highway. My hands were shaking, and I felt tears welling up. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just let them keep following me. I took a deep breath and decided to try something risky. I slammed on my brakes, hoping to catch them off guard. The car behind me screeched to a halt, and I took the chance to speed off again, putting some distance between us. But it didn't last long. They caught up quickly, even more determined now. They pulled up alongside me, and I could see a figure gesturing wildly. It didn't look like they wanted to talk. It felt like a threat. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do next. I saw a sign for an upcoming exit and decided to take it. Maybe I could lose them on the smaller roads. I swerved onto the exit ramp, my tires screeching. The car followed, still flashing its lights. The road was winding, and I hoped I could use the curves to my advantage. I drove as fast as I dared, the car still right behind me. I spotted a small diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering. It looked like it was still open. I made a split-second decision and turned sharply into the diner's parking lot, almost skidding to a stop. I jumped out of my car and ran inside, breathless and terrified. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of late-night customers and the cook behind the counter. I quickly told them what was happening, my words tumbling out in a panic. The cook nodded and went to the phone to call the police. I glanced out the window and saw the car idling in the parking lot, its headlights still on. The driver was just sitting there, watching. I felt a chill run down my spine. The police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity. The cook came over, trying to reassure me, but I couldn't shake the fear. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling into the lot. The car that had been following me sped off, tires screeching. The police officer ran in, and I quickly told him everything. He took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area, but the driver was long gone. The officer offered to follow me home to make sure I was safe, and I gratefully accepted. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying the night's events over and over. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jump. The fear lingered long after that night. Every time I drive at night now, I can't help but check my rearview mirror constantly, always wondering if someone might be following me again. I was out camping in a national park, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. It was peaceful, just the way I liked it. But one night, things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting by the campfire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet, when I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up to see a man wearing a ranger uniform coming towards me. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. He introduced himself as Ranger Mark and asked if he could join me by the fire. I hesitated for a moment, but then I figured it couldn't hurt to have some company. So I nodded and gestured for him to sit down. We chatted for a while, and I started to relax in his presence. But then he started asking me strange questions, like where I was from and if I was camping alone. I tried to brush it off, but his questions were making me increasingly uncomfortable. Eventually, I decided to call it a night and head back to my tent. But as I got up to leave, Ranger Mark grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice cold and menacing. I tried to pull away, but his grip was too tight. I could feel my heart racing as I realized that something was seriously wrong. "Let go of me!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. But Ranger Mark just laughed and dragged me towards his truck. I struggled and fought as hard as I could, but he was too strong. He threw me into the back of the truck and slammed the door shut behind me. I was trapped, with no way out and no idea what he was planning to do to me. I screamed for help, but we were deep in the woods, far from anyone who could hear me. I was completely at his mercy, and I didn't know if I would ever make it out alive. But then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of another car approaching. Ranger Mark cursed under his breath and quickly drove off into the night, leaving me behind in the darkness. I waited until I was sure he was gone, and then I crawled out of the truck and ran as fast as I could back to my campsite. I packed up my things in record time and didn't stop running until I reached the nearest ranger station. I told them everything that had happened, and they immediately launched an investigation. They found Ranger Mark's truck abandoned in the woods, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I was shaken to my core by the encounter, but I was alive, and that was all that mattered. I vowed never to go camping alone again, and I made sure to tell everyone I knew about what had happened to me. To this day, I still shudder at the memory of that night in the national park, and I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the terror of being stalked by someone I thought I could trust. I was stuck at the train station during one of the worst storms I had ever seen. The rain was pounding against the windows, and the wind howled like a wild animal. I had missed my train home, and the next one wasn't due for hours. The station was almost empty, just me and a few other unlucky souls stranded by the weather. I sat on a cold, metal bench, watching the rain. The lights flickered occasionally, making the shadows in the corners dance. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to get comfortable, but the bench was hard, and the air was damp and chilly. After a while, I noticed a man walking towards me. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark uniform. I assumed he was a security guard, though I hadn't seen him before. He had a badge clipped to his chest and a flashlight in his hand. "Evening," he said, his voice deep and slightly raspy. "You waiting for the next train?" "Yeah," I replied. "Got stuck here because of the storm." "Bad one, isn't it?" He glanced at the windows, the rain still hammering down. "Name's Carl. I'm the night security here." "I'm Laura," I said. "Nice to meet you." He nodded and sat down on the bench across from me. His presence was a bit unsettling, but I figured he was just doing his job. We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the storm. "Not many people here tonight," he said finally, looking around the empty station. Most folks cleared out before it got this bad. Yeah, it's pretty deserted, I agreed. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. So, Laura, where you headed? Home, I said. Just trying to get home. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving my face. You know, it's not safe for a young woman to be alone in a place like this. Lots of strange people around. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. I'm fine, I said quickly. Just waiting for my train. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, if you need anything, I'll be around. He stood up and walked away, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. I watched him disappear into the shadows, feeling a sense of relief once he was gone. But the relief didn't last long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I couldn't focus. Every time the lights flickered, I glanced around, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. The minutes dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to stretch my legs. I walked down the platform, trying to shake off the unease. As I passed a row of lockers, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Just the empty station and the sound of the storm. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no reason to be scared. But as I turned to head back to my bench, I saw him again. Carl, standing at the far end of the platform, watching me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark and intense. I forced a smile and nodded at him, hoping to appear calm. He didn't respond, just kept staring. I hurried back to my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I needed to find a way out of there, but with the storm raging outside, I had nowhere to go. I decided to go to the restroom, hoping to buy some time and gather my thoughts. The restroom was down a dimly lit hallway, and as I walked, I felt like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. Inside the restroom, I splashed some water on my face and took a deep breath. I needed to stay calm and think clearly. But when I stepped out, Carl was there, leaning against the wall. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Yeah, just needed a break," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a step closer, and I could see the cold glint in his eyes. "You know, the storm's getting worse. Might be a good idea to find somewhere safer to wait." "I'm fine here," I insisted, backing away. His smile faded, replaced by a hard, menacing look. "I don't think you understand. It's not safe here." My heart was racing now. I needed to get away from him. "I'll take my chances," I said, turning to leave. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "I'm not giving you a choice," he growled. I yanked my arm free and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. I could hear him behind me, his boots pounding on the floor. I didn't know where to go, but I had to get away. I darted down a hallway and into a storage room, slamming the door shut behind me. I looked around, my eyes searching for something to block the door. I spotted a heavy shelf and pushed it against the door, my hands shaking. I could hear Carl outside, trying the handle and then pounding on the door. "Let me in, Laura," he shouted. "You're only making this harder on yourself." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to find a way to call for help. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. I was trapped. I heard a crash outside and realized he was trying to break down the door. I had to think fast. I looked around the room and spotted a small window near the ceiling. It was a tight fit, but it was my only chance. I climbed up on a stack of boxes and pushed the window open. The rain and wind hit me immediately, but I didn't care. I squeezed through the window, cutting my hands on the glass, and dropped down onto the wet pavement outside. I could hear Carl shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran through the storm, my clothes soaked and my heart pounding. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from him. I finally saw the lights of a nearby building and ran towards it. It was a small diner, and the sight of it filled me with relief. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. The few people inside turned to look at me, their faces filled with concern. "Help," I managed to say. "There's a man. He's after me." The staff quickly called the police, and they arrived within minutes. I told them everything, and they assured me I was safe now. They found Carl still trying to break into the storage room, and he was arrested. The ordeal left me shaken, but I was grateful to be alive. I never thought a simple trip could turn into a nightmare, but it did. I'll never forget the look in Carl's eyes, the fear and anger. It's something that will haunt me forever. Working the night shift at the pharmacy was usually pretty quiet. I spent most of my time stocking shelves, filling prescriptions, and keeping an eye on things. But lately, things had been getting a little weird. I had been noticing that certain medications were going missing, painkillers, sleeping pills, stuff like that. At first, I thought maybe I had miscounted or misplaced them, but it kept happening, night after night. I started to get suspicious, wondering if someone was stealing the meds. But I couldn't figure out how they were doing it. The pharmacy was locked up tight at night, and there were security cameras everywhere. One night, I decided to stay late and try to catch whoever was behind it. I hid in the back room, waiting and watching for any sign of movement. Sure enough, around midnight, I heard a noise coming from the front of the store. I crept out of the back room, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the front counter. There, standing behind the counter, was a man I had never seen before. He was rummaging through the shelves, grabbing bottles of pills and stuffing them into his pockets. I felt a surge of anger coursing through me as I realized what was happening. This guy was the one stealing the medications, and he had been doing it right under my nose the whole time. I knew I should have called the police right then and there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the adrenaline pumping through my veins, or maybe it was just sheer stupidity, but I decided to confront him instead. I stepped out from behind the counter, my hands trembling with fear and anger. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty store. "What do you think you're doing?" The man spun around, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw me standing there. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us sure what to do next. Then, without warning, he lunged at me, his fists flying. I barely had time to react, ducking out of the way just in time to avoid his blows. We grappled with each other, stumbling around the store in a frantic dance of violence. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, dulling the pain of each blow as we fought. But I knew I couldn't keep it up forever. The man was bigger and stronger than me, and it was only a matter of time before he overpowered me. I needed to end this, and fast. With a surge of determination, I managed to land a solid punch to his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. I didn't stick around to see if he was okay. I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them everything that had happened. They arrived quickly, and together we were able to apprehend the man and take him into custody. It turned out he had been stealing the medications to sell on the black market, a desperate attempt to make some quick cash. In the end, I was hailed as a hero for stopping him. But as I lay in bed that night, my body bruised and sore from the fight, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that lingered in the back of my mind. I had come face to face with danger that night, and I had survived. But I knew that not everyone was so lucky, and that the world could be a much scarier place than I had ever imagined. I'm a survivalist, someone who thrives on the challenge of the great outdoors. So when I decided to embark on a solo camping trip deep in the wilderness, I knew I was in for an adventure. But as I set up camp in a secluded clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest seemed eerily quiet, as if the very trees were holding their breath in anticipation of something sinister. And then, just as I was settling in for the night, I heard the sound of voices echoing through the trees, low and guttural, like the growls of wild animals. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was now alone in the wilderness. With my heart pounding in my chest, I crouched down low and listened intently, trying to make out what the voices were saying. But their words were muffled and indistinct, carried away on the wind before I could decipher them. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to avoid detection. With trembling hands, I doused the fire and packed up my gear, moving silently through the trees like a shadow in the night. But just when I thought I had escaped the poachers' notice, I stumbled upon their camp hidden deep in the forest. My blood ran cold as I caught sight of them, a group of men armed to the teeth with rifles and machetes, their faces obscured by the darkness. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was outnumbered and outgunned. I knew I had to find a way to evade capture and make it out of the forest alive. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I ducked behind a tree and waited for the perfect moment to make my move. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me as I waited for the poachers to pass by. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I caught sight of something moving in the darkness, something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light as it prowled through the trees. Panic surged through me as I realized that the poachers were not just hunting animals, they were hunting something far more dangerous. And I knew that if they caught sight of me, I would be next on their list. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself to my feet and raced through the forest, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the trees as I fled for my life. But the creature was hot on my trail, its growls echoing through the darkness like a death knell. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I stumbled upon a narrow ravine hidden deep in the heart of the forest. With no other options left, I leaped into the darkness and prayed that I would survive the fall. Miraculously, I landed safely at the bottom of the ravine, my body battered and bruised but still alive. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening intently for any sign of danger. But the forest was eerily silent, as if the very trees were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. With trembling hands, I pushed myself to my feet and began to make my way out of the ravine and back to safety. And then, finally, I emerged from the darkness of the forest and into the light of day. Relief flooded through me as I realized that I had escaped the clutches of the poachers and the creature that hunted in their midst. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, while my dog, Max, lay at my feet, when I noticed something strange. He started growling low in his throat, his hackles raised, his eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room. I looked over, but there was nothing there, just an empty space by the bookshelf. I tried to reassure him, telling him it was okay, but he wouldn't stop growling, his teeth bared in a menacing snarl. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sense of unease creeping over me as I realized that something was very wrong. Max wasn't the type to growl for no reason. He was usually the friendliest dog you could ever hope to meet. I got up from the couch, my heart pounding in my chest, and approached him cautiously. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. But he just continued to growl, his eyes never leaving the spot in the corner. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I tried to think of what could be causing his behavior. Maybe there was a mouse or a bug that I hadn't noticed, something that was agitating him without me realizing it. But then, suddenly, Max's growls turned into frantic barks, his body tensing as if he were preparing to attack. I took a step back, my pulse racing, as I watched him lunge at the empty space in the corner, snapping his jaws as if he were trying to catch something. I screamed, my voice echoing off the walls of the apartment, as I realized that there was nothing there, nothing that I could see, at least. But Max was still barking and snarling, his behavior becoming more and more erratic by the second. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest as I backed away from him, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening? What was he seeing that I couldn't? And then, just as suddenly as it had started, Max's behavior stopped. He whimpered softly, his tail tucked between his legs, as he slumped back to his bed, his eyes wide with fear. I sank down onto the couch, my hands shaking, as I tried to process what had just happened. There was no logical explanation for it, no rational way to explain why my dog had suddenly turned on me like that. But as I sat there, trembling and alone in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the apartment, that there was something lurking in the shadows, something that Max could see but I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. And though I never saw anything out of the ordinary again, the memory of that night haunted me for weeks to come. It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain pounded on the roof like it was trying to break in, and the wind howled through the trees. I was alone in my farmhouse, nestled in the middle of nowhere. The power had gone out an hour ago, leaving me in the dim glow of candles scattered around the living room. I was reading a book, trying to ignore the creepy sounds outside when I heard it, a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could be out here in this weather? I got up slowly, feeling uneasy, and walked to the door. When I opened it, a man stood there, drenched to the bone. He looked harmless enough, but something about him made me nervous. "My car broke down," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Can I come in and use your phone?" I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. But I didn't want to be heartless. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He thanked me and stepped into the hallway, water dripping from his clothes. I pointed to the phone in the kitchen. "It's over there. Help yourself." He nodded and walked in that direction, and I followed him, trying to shake off the bad feeling in my gut. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. As he talked, I noticed him glancing around, taking in the details of my house. "Thanks for letting me in," he said, hanging up the phone. "My name's David, by the way." "Emma," I replied, still feeling uneasy. "Did you get through to someone?" "Yeah, my friend will be here in about an hour," he said. "Mind if I wait here?" I didn't like the idea, but what choice did I have? "Sure, make yourself comfortable," I said, trying to sound more at ease than I felt. He sat on the couch, and I offered him a towel, which he accepted gratefully. We made small talk for a bit. He seemed normal enough, but then he started saying things that set off alarm bells. "You've got a really nice place here," he said, looking around. "I've always liked old farmhouses like this. Your family must have had it for generations." My blood ran cold. How did he know that? "Yeah," I said cautiously. "It was my grandparents." He nodded, like he already knew. "I bet it has some interesting stories," he said, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made me feel like he could see right through me. I forced a smile. "Yeah, it does." But it's just me here now. David's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. That must get lonely sometimes. I felt a chill run down my spine. Not really, I lied. I like the peace and quiet. He leaned back, seeming too comfortable. You must be really brave, living out here all alone. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I stood up, needing to put some distance between us. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, tea? Coffee would be great, he said, his eyes following me as I moved to the kitchen. I started the coffee maker, my mind racing. I needed to get him out of here. When I turned back, he was standing in the doorway, watching me. You've got a lot of family photos, he said, nodding toward the hallway where the pictures hung. Yeah, I said, my voice tight. Lots of memories. He stepped closer, and I fought the urge to back away. It's funny, he said softly. I feel like I know this place. Like I've been here before. My heart was pounding now. Maybe you drove by sometime, I said, trying to sound casual. Maybe, he said, but his smile told me he didn't believe it. Or maybe it's just so welcoming. I forced a laugh. Yeah, I guess so. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured him a cup, my hand shaking slightly. As I handed it to him, he grabbed my wrist. Thanks, Emma, he said, his grip tightening. You're really kind. I pulled my hand away, my heart racing. You're welcome, I said, stepping back. Your friend should be here soon. He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. I hope so, he said. I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome. I smiled, but inside I was panicking. I needed to get him out of here. You know, the storm's letting up, I said. Maybe you should wait outside, so you don't miss your friend. He didn't move. It's still pretty rough out there, he said. I'm sure you don't mind me staying a bit longer. I was running out of options. Actually, I do, I said, trying to sound firm. I'm really tired and need to get some sleep. He put down the coffee cup and stood up, his smile gone. That's too bad, he said, his voice low. I was hoping we could get to know each other better. Fear shot through me. Please, just go, I said, my voice shaking. He took a step toward me, and I backed up until I hit the counter. Emma, don't be like that, he said, his eyes cold. We were just starting to have fun. I grabbed a knife from the counter, holding it between us. Get out, I said, my voice steady now. He raised his hands, smirking. Okay. No need for that. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I followed him to the door, the knife still in my hand. Go, I said again. He opened the door and stepped outside, the rain still pouring down. I'll be seeing you, Emma, he said, his voice a chilling promise. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. I watched through the window as he walked away, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid he might come back. When morning finally came, I called the police and told them everything. They promised to keep an eye on the area, but I knew I wouldn't feel safe for a long time. That night changed everything. I wasn't just a farmer living in a quiet old house anymore. I was a survivor, and I would never let my guard down again. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me and Mark in the remote forests of Oregon. We both needed a break from work and the constant noise of the city. We drove for hours to reach the campsite, a spot Mark had found online that promised solitude and beauty. When we arrived, The place was everything we hoped for: dense trees, a clear stream nearby, and the kind of silence that felt both soothing and eerie. We set up our tent, made a fire, and cooked dinner. As the sun started to set, we noticed another campsite about 100 yards away. At first, it was a bit disappointing. We had come all this way to be alone, but there they were, 2 other people setting up their camp. Mark waved at them, and they waved back. They seemed friendly enough, a man and a woman, both probably in their early 30s like us. After dinner, we decided to go over and say hi. It seemed rude to ignore them, and we figured it might be nice to have some company. We walked over, introduced ourselves, and they told us their names, Dan and Lisa. They were from Portland, out here for the same reason we were, to escape and enjoy nature. We chatted for a while, shared a few laughs, and even exchanged stories about our lives in the city. They seemed normal, maybe a bit too eager to befriend us, but we didn't think much of it. As it got darker, we headed back to our campsite. Mark suggested we stay up a bit longer and enjoy the stars. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing. But I couldn't shake a strange feeling. There was something off about Dan and Lisa. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling lingered. We went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, rustling leaves, twigs snapping. I nudged Mark awake. He listened for a moment and said it was probably just animals. He fell back asleep, but I stayed awake, my heart racing every time I heard a sound. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike. As we were getting ready, Dan and Lisa came over. They invited us to join them, saying they knew a great trail with an amazing view. Mark was all for it, but I hesitated. Something about the way they looked at us made me uneasy. But I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid, so I agreed. The hike started off fine. The trail was beautiful, just like they said. But as we walked, Dan and Lisa kept whispering to each other, glancing back at us with strange expressions. Mark didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't ignore it. My anxiety grew with every step. We reached the viewpoint, and it was breathtaking. We all stood there, taking in the view. But then, out of nowhere, Dan asked us a weird question. He wanted to know if anyone knew we were out here, if we told anyone exactly where we were camping. Mark answered casually, saying our families knew we were in the area but not the exact spot. Dan and Lisa exchanged a quick look that sent chills down my spine. On the way back, I whispered to Mark that we needed to leave. He looked at me like I was overreacting, but I insisted. He finally agreed, probably just to calm me down. When we got back to our campsite, we packed up as quickly as we could. Dan and Lisa came over, asking why we were leaving so soon. Mark made up an excuse about needing to get back to the city. As we were packing, I noticed Lisa rummaging through our stuff, pretending to help but clearly looking for something. I confronted her, and she backed off, laughing it off like it was no big deal. We finished packing, said a hurried goodbye, and drove off. As we left, I looked back and saw Dan and Lisa standing there, watching us with those unsettling smiles. The drive back was tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see their car following us. We finally got back to the city, and I felt a huge sense of relief. We told our friends about the trip, leaving out the creepy parts. Mark thought I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad would have happened if we stayed. A few days later, I saw a news report about a couple who had gone missing in the same area we were camping. They described the couple, and my heart skipped a beat. It was Dan and Lisa. The police found their campsite abandoned, no signs of a struggle, just gone. I don't know what happened to them, and part of me doesn't want to know. I'm just glad we got out of there when we did. I haven't been camping since. I was driving late at night when I decided to stop at a small, rundown motel off the highway. It was the only place around, and I was exhausted. The sign was flickering, and the parking lot was almost empty. I went inside to check in, and the man at the desk seemed friendly enough, though his smile felt forced. He gave me a room key and pointed me down the hall. The room was dingy but passable for one night. I tossed my bag on the bed and tried to unwind. After a while, I decided to take a shower. When I finished, I noticed the doorknob on my room door was loose. I twisted it, but it didn't budge. Panic started to set in when I realized I was locked in. I fiddled with the knob, trying to get it to turn, but it was useless. I banged on the door and called out, hoping someone would hear me, but the hallway outside remained silent. I grabbed my phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi wasn't working either. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down and think. That's when I heard a noise coming from the adjoining room. It sounded like muffled voices and shuffling. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. The voices were low, almost whispering, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then I heard a faint cry, like someone was in pain. I knocked on the wall, hoping to get the attention of whoever was next door. The voices stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then, the door to the adjoining room opened, and I heard footsteps in the hallway. I rushed to the door and banged on it, shouting for help, but no one responded. My heart was racing. I felt trapped and helpless. I searched the room for anything that could help me get out. I found a metal coat hanger in the closet and tried to use it to jimmy the lock, but it was no use. The doorknob was completely jammed. The sounds from the adjoining room started again. This time, they were louder and more frantic. I heard what sounded like someone being dragged. I pressed my ear to the wall again and heard a woman's voice, pleading and crying. Fear gripped me as I realized I wasn't alone in this nightmare. Desperation took over. I started banging on the walls and shouting for help. The noises in the other room grew more intense, and I could hear the woman struggling. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. I backed away from the wall, trembling. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching my door. The doorknob rattled, and then there was a knock. I didn't know if it was someone coming to help or if it was whoever was in the other room. My heart pounded as I waited, unsure of what to do. "Hello," a voice called out. It was the man from the front desk. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I ran to the door and shouted that I was locked in. He said he would get the key and be right back. I waited anxiously, listening to his footsteps fade away. When he returned, he unlocked the door and opened it. I rushed out, thanking him profusely. But then I noticed his expression. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look. He grabbed my arm tightly and pulled me down the hall, ignoring my protests. He dragged me to the front office and shoved me inside. I stumbled and fell to the floor. When I looked up, I saw a woman tied to a chair, her face bruised and tear-streaked. The man looked down at me, his eyes cold and menacing. "Welcome to our little operation," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have made so much noise." I realized then that this was all a trap. The motel was a front for something sinister, and I had walked right into it. The man tied me to a chair next to the woman and left us there, locking the door behind him. The woman whispered that we needed to find a way out, but I couldn't see any way to escape. We struggled against our bonds, trying to loosen them, but they were too tight. Hours passed, and I felt my hope fading. Just when I thought all was lost, I heard sirens in the distance. The man came back, panic in his eyes. He hurried to untie us, threatening us to stay quiet. But as soon as he released my hands, I fought back with all the strength I had left. The police burst in moments later, guns drawn. They arrested the man and freed us. It turned out someone had heard my earlier screams and called the authorities. They found evidence of the motel's illegal activities and shut it down for good. Even though I got out alive, the experience left me scarred. I can still hear the cries of the woman in the next room and feel the grip of the caretaker's hand on my arm. We rented a remote cabin in the Canadian wilderness for a week-long family vacation. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My husband Mark, our 2 kids, Emily and Jake, and I were looking forward to disconnecting from the world and spending quality time together. The cabin was isolated, nestled among tall trees with a beautiful lake nearby. It seemed perfect. The first couple of days were wonderful. We hiked, swam, and fished. The kids were having a blast, and Mark and I enjoyed the break from our busy lives. The nights were quiet, with only the sounds of nature around us. On the 3rd night, everything changed. We were sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows, when we heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps. Mark went to check but saw nothing. We brushed it off, thinking it might be an animal. A little while later, we heard it again, closer this time. My heart started to race. Mark looked uneasy but tried to keep calm for the kids. Suddenly, the door burst open and 3 men stormed in. They had guns. I grabbed Emily and Jake, pulling them close. Mark tried to reason with them, but they shouted for us to be quiet. One of them, the leader I guessed, told us they needed a place to hide for a while. They were on the run, and we were their unlucky hosts. They tied Mark and me up, keeping the kids close to us. My mind raced with fear and desperation. The leader, a tall man with a scar on his face, told us if we cooperated, we wouldn't get hurt. I tried to believe him, but I could see the coldness in his eyes. They took turns watching us. The other 2 men, both younger, seemed nervous, always glancing out the windows. They spoke in low voices, discussing their plans. I caught bits and pieces, enough to know they were dangerous and desperate. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking of ways to escape but found none. The next morning, the men allowed us to eat breakfast under their watchful eyes. Emily and Jake were scared, clinging to me. Mark tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. As the day went on, I noticed the men were getting agitated. They argued among themselves, their tempers flaring. I knew we had to do something before things got worse. I whispered to Mark, telling him we needed to find a way out. He nodded, his jaw set in determination. That evening, I noticed one of the younger men seemed more sympathetic. He watched us but didn't seem as hardened as the others. I decided to take a risk. When the other men weren't looking, I whispered to him, begging for help. He looked conflicted but didn't respond. Later, when the leader stepped outside, the sympathetic man came over to me. He said he couldn't let us go but would leave the back door unlocked that night. It was our chance. I thanked him quietly, praying he was telling the truth. That night, once the men fell asleep, I whispered to Mark. We untied ourselves carefully, trying not to make a sound. I held Emily, and Mark carried Jake. We crept to the back door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would wake the men. The door was unlocked, just as the man had promised. We slipped outside into the darkness, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The forest was dense, and we stumbled over roots and branches, but we kept going. We had to put as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. After what felt like hours, we reached the lake. We followed its edge, knowing it would lead us back to civilization. The kids were exhausted, but they were brave, not making a sound. I kept looking back, fearing we were being followed. At dawn, we saw a small fishing boat on the shore. Mark checked it and found it was still functional. We climbed in, and Mark started rowing. I held the kids, trying to keep them calm. The boat moved slowly, but it was taking us away from the nightmare we had just escaped. We reached a small town by midday. We found the local authorities and told them everything. They took us in, gave us food and blankets, and assured us we were safe. The police went to the cabin, but the men were gone. They promised to keep looking for them. We stayed in that town for a couple of days, recovering from the ordeal. The kids had nightmares, and so did we. It took a long time to feel safe again. We never found out what happened to the men, but I hope they were caught and couldn't hurt anyone else. That experience changed us. We were more cautious, more aware of the dangers that could be out there. But we were also more grateful for each other. We had faced a terrifying situation and made it through together. That bond, that strength, stayed with us. We never went back to that cabin or any remote places for vacations again. The wilderness that once seemed so peaceful now felt threatening. We stuck to safer, more populated areas. And every time I hear a noise in the night, I remember the cabin and the men who held us hostage. But I also remember how we escaped, and that gives me strength. We were driving late at night, heading through a remote area when we decided to stop at a small, rundown motel. It was the only place for miles, and we were exhausted. The neon sign flickered, and the parking lot was nearly empty. We checked in and got our key from the old man at the front desk, who barely looked up from his book. Our room was shabby but clean enough. As we unpacked, I heard a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it was a cat or some other animal. But then I heard it again, a soft, muffled cry. I looked at my partner, Mark, and he nodded. We both went outside to investigate. In the corner of the parking lot, near a broken-down car, we found a small bundle. It was an infant, wrapped in a dirty blanket. The baby was crying softly, its little face red and scared. My heart sank. Who would leave a baby out here like this? We picked up the baby and hurried back to our room, trying to calm it down. We needed to call the authorities, but there was no cell signal in this remote area. The only option was the phone in our room. I dialed the front desk, but there was no answer. Mark decided to go to the office to get help. I stayed in the room, rocking the baby and trying to keep it calm. Minutes passed, and I started to worry when Mark didn't come back. The baby's cries grew louder, and I felt more and more uneasy. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I wrapped the baby up again and went to find Mark. The hallway was dimly lit, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I reached the front desk, but it was empty. The old man was gone, and there was no sign of Mark. I heard a noise coming from behind the desk, like something being dragged. I walked around and saw a door slightly ajar. Inside, there was a staircase leading down. I hesitated, but then heard a muffled cry for help. It was Mark. I descended the stairs, holding the baby close. The basement was cold and dark. I saw a light under a door at the far end. I moved quietly, trying not to make any noise. When I reached the door, I peeked through the crack. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were several children, all locked in cages. Mark was tied to a chair, and the old man from the front desk was talking to another man. They were discussing the shipment and how they needed to move the children soon. I realized with horror that we had stumbled upon a child trafficking ring. I backed away slowly, trying to think of a plan. I had to get Mark and the children out, but I couldn't do it alone. I decided to go back to our room and look for something that could help. On my way back, I found a fire extinguisher in the hallway. It wasn't much, but it was something. I returned to the basement door and waited for the right moment. The old man and his partner were busy, so I quietly opened the door and slipped inside. I went to Mark first and used the extinguisher to break the ropes binding him. He was weak but managed to stand. We moved quickly, opening the cages and freeing the children. We had to be quiet, but some of them were so scared they started to cry. The men heard the noise and turned around. I raised the extinguisher and sprayed it in their faces, buying us a few precious seconds. We ran up the stairs, the children following closely. I slammed the door shut behind us and jammed a chair under the handle to buy us more time. We ran out into the parking lot, desperately looking for help. Just then, a car pulled in, and I waved frantically. The driver saw us and stopped. We explained the situation quickly, and he called the police. It felt like an eternity before they arrived, but when they did, they swarmed the motel. The 2 men were arrested, and the children were taken to safety. Mark and I were shaken, but we stayed to give our statements. The police thanked us for our bravery and told us that the traffickers had been wanted for a long time. They had been using the remote motel as a front for their operations. That night, as we finally drove away from that horrible place, we held hands tightly, the baby's cries still echoing in our ears. We knew we had done the right thing, but the memory of those terrified children would stay with us forever. We promised each other that we would always be vigilant and never ignore a cry for help, no matter how small. The rain started just after we arrived at the cabin. Jenny, Alex, Rachel, and I had planned this weekend getaway for months. It was supposed to be a break from our hectic lives, just a couple of days to relax, play games, and catch up. The cabin was cozy, tucked away in the woods, perfect for what we needed. By nightfall, the storm had turned fierce. The wind howled, and the rain hammered the windows. We had a fire going in the fireplace, the only light in the room since the power had gone out. We huddled around, telling stories and laughing, trying to ignore the weather outside. Around 10 p.m., there was a knock on the door. It was so unexpected that we all jumped. I exchanged a look with Jenny, then got up to see who it could be. Through the peephole, I saw a man, soaking wet, shivering. He looked desperate. I cracked the door open, keeping the chain on. "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice shaking. "My car broke down a mile back. Can I come in and use your phone to call for help? My gut told me something was off. There's no phone service up here, and the power's out." His eyes darted around, like he was thinking. "Please, I just need to get out of the rain." Jenny came up behind me. "Maybe we should let him in, just for a bit." Reluctantly, I unchained the door. The man stepped in, water pooling on the floor around him. He looked around the cabin, and I noticed his eyes lingered on each of us a bit too long. "Thank you," he said. "I'm Tom." We introduced ourselves, though I felt uneasy. He sat by the fire, warming his hands. "It's really coming down out there," he said, trying to make small talk. "Yeah," Alex replied. "We're lucky we got here before it started." Tom nodded, then looked at me. "You sure there's no phone service? Not even a landline?" "No, nothing," I said. "We're pretty isolated here." Rachel, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "What happened to your car?" Tom hesitated, then said, "Hit something in the road, maybe a branch. Engine just died." Rachel looked at me, her eyebrows raised. I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. His story didn't add up. I walked through a storm to a cabin with no guarantee of help. I decided to test him. We have a radio in the back. Maybe you can get a signal and call for help. Tom's face twitched, but he smiled. That would be great, thanks. I led him to the back room, where we kept the old radio. As he fiddled with it, I noticed something sticking out of his coat pocket. It looked like a piece of paper, but I couldn't make out what it was. Weird that your car died so suddenly, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Where are you heading? Just passing through, he replied, not looking up from the radio. His answers were too vague. I needed to talk to the others without him hearing. Let me check on the others, I said, and quickly left the room. Back in the living room, I whispered to Jenny, Alex, and Rachel. Something's wrong. His story doesn't add up. Rachel nodded. I thought the same thing. He seems too calm. What do we do? Alex asked, glancing nervously at the hallway. We need to stay together, I said, and watch him closely. Tom came back out, shaking his head. No luck with the radio. Looks like I'm stuck here until the storm passes. We nodded, trying to act natural. But the tension was thick. We played a game of cards, Tom joining in. Every time he looked away, we exchanged worried glances. Something about him was definitely off. After a while, Tom excused himself to use the bathroom. As soon as he was out of earshot, Rachel leaned in. We need to search his stuff. See if we can find anything. Agreed, I said. Alex, keep an eye on him. Rachel and I slipped into the back room. We found his coat and searched the pockets. There was a piece of paper, folded up. When we opened it, our blood ran cold. It was a map of the area, with our cabin circled in red. There were notes scribbled on it, timing, how many people, the layout of the cabin. This isn't random, Rachel whispered. He planned this. We heard footsteps and quickly put the paper back. Tom reappeared, looking at us suspiciously. What are you doing? Just checking something, I said, trying to stay calm. Tom's smile didn't reach his eyes. Everything okay? Yeah, fine, I replied, moving past him. We should get back to the others. Back in the living room, I discreetly showed Jenny and Alex the map. Their faces went pale. We knew we had to act fast. Tom was dangerous, and we were trapped with him. We needed a plan. I whispered to Jenny and Alex, telling them to follow my lead. Rachel distracted Tom with questions while we gathered supplies, anything we could use as weapons. A heavy flashlight, a kitchen knife, a fireplace poker. Tom was getting impatient. What's taking so long? He asked, eyes narrowing. Just a minute, I said, trying to sound casual. Rachel wanted to show you something. Tom followed Rachel to the back room, and we seized the moment. We barricaded the front door and windows, then hid near the hallway, weapons in hand. When Tom realized Rachel had tricked him, he stormed back out, furious. What's going on here? He demanded, his face twisted with rage. Get out of our cabin, I said, stepping forward with the flashlight raised. Tom's eyes darted to the door, then back at us. You don't understand. I need this place. No, you need to leave, Jenny said, holding the knife steady. Tom lunged at us, but we were ready. Alex swung the poker, catching him in the side. He stumbled, and Jenny jabbed the knife forward, not enough to injure him seriously, but enough to make him back off. Get out. I shouted again. Tom looked at us, breathing hard. Then he turned and bolted for the back door. We didn't chase him, just locked it behind him and collapsed in relief. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, but Tom didn't come back. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. We packed up quickly and left the cabin, reporting the incident to the local authorities as soon as we got to town. They found Tom's abandoned car, but no sign of him. It was clear he had been planning something bad, and we were lucky to have escaped unarmed. That weekend getaway turned into a nightmare, one we wouldn't forget. I was out there, just me in the jungle. It was dense, like every step I took was into another world. I was searching for something, I don't know what, just chasing that feeling of adventure. Then, I stumbled upon this clearing, and in the middle of it was this village. It was like something out of a history book, all huts and thatched roofs. I couldn't believe it. I heard rumors about hidden tribes in the jungle, but I never thought I'd actually find one. I approached the village cautiously, not wanting to startle anyone. But as soon as I got close, the villagers came pouring out of their huts, staring at me like I was some kind of alien. I tried to communicate with them, but we didn't speak the same language. It was frustrating, like trying to talk to a brick wall. But I wasn't about to give up. I needed to know more about these people, about their way of life. So, I stuck around, trying to pick up on their customs and rituals. And that's when things started to get weird. I noticed these strange symbols painted on the walls of their huts, symbols that I couldn't make heads or tails of. I tried asking the villagers about them, but they just gave me these blank stares, like they didn't know what I was talking about. It was like they were hiding something from me, something dark and sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just the jungle, stretching out in every direction. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, like the jungle was playing tricks on me. But then, one night, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. I was wandering through the village, trying to clear my head, when I heard this chanting coming from the center of town. I followed the sound, and that's when I saw them. The villagers gathered around this bonfire, chanting and swaying like something out of a cult. I watched in horror as they started to dance, their movements becoming more and more frenzied. And then, I saw it. In the center of the circle, there was this thing. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, all twisted and grotesque. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that village as possible. But something held me back, some morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. And then, the thing spoke. Its voice was like nails on a chalkboard, grating and inhuman. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the villagers seemed to hang on its every word. I watched in horror as they offered its sacrifices, animals, and other things. And then, they turned their eyes on me, like I was next in line. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. So, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was deep in the jungle, far away from the cursed village. I don't know what I stumbled upon out there in the jungle, and I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and evil. And I pray that I never have to experience anything like it again. I was alone in my cabin, just chillin' after a long day of fixin' cars. The night was quiet, only the sound of crickets outside. Suddenly, I heard it, a distant rumble of an engine. I peered out the window, trying to see what's up. Didn't expect to see a car coming down my driveway at this hour. My heart started racing when I saw a bunch of figures get out of the car. They were wearing masks, creepy ones. I didn't recognize them. Panic started crawling up my spine. What were they doing here? I had this gut feeling that something ain't right. I locked the door, but I could hear them outside, talking in low voices. They were up to no good. I could sense it. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but there was no signal. Figures. I was on my own. Then, they started banging on the door, demanding to be let in. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. I was sweating bullets, trying to stay calm. I heard him talking about breaking in. My mind was spinning, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to bust through the door. I remembered I had some tools in the garage, heavy stuff. I grabbed a wrench, holding onto it like my life depended on it. 'Cause it did. When they finally broke through the door, I was ready. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins as I swung that wrench, fighting for my life. It was chaos, fists flying, shouts echoing through the cabin. I managed to knock one of them down, but there were still more coming. They were relentless, like a pack of wolves. I was scared, but I wasn't gonna let him win. I fought like hell, every swing of that wrench fueled by fear and desperation. I could feel bruises form on my body, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Finally, I saw my chance and bolted for the door. I ran like I never ran before, heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I made it to the woods, ducking and weaving through the trees like my life depended on it, 'cause it did. I didn't stop till I reached the main road, panting and gasping for breath. I didn't look back till I reached town. The cabin was far behind me, but the memory of that night would haunt me forever. I survived, but I'd never forget the terror of being hunted in my own home. I was camping alone on a cliffside in Wales, enjoying the solitude and the breathtaking view of the rugged coastline below. It was a remote spot, far from any towns or villages, but I liked it that way. I had everything I needed: a tent, a sleeping bag, some food and water, and a sense of adventure. One evening, as the sun was setting, I noticed a figure approaching my campsite. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but as he got closer, I realized there was something off about him. He moved with a strange, jerky gait, and his eyes darted around nervously. "Hello there," he said, his voice high-pitched and shaky. "Mind if I join you for the night?" I hesitated, unsure of what to say. He seemed harmless enough, but there was something about him that set off alarm bells in my head. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I reluctantly agreed. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The man didn't say much, but whenever I tried to make conversation, he would just stare at me with those unsettling eyes. I started to regret letting him into my campsite, but there wasn't much I could do about it now. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night, hoping that sleep would bring some relief from my growing anxiety. I crawled into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, straining to hear any movement. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone unzipping the tent flap. I froze, my mind racing with fear. Who was it? What did they want? I tried to stay calm as I waited for them to make their move. "Time to go," a voice whispered from outside the tent. It was the man from earlier, and he sounded angry. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and scrambled out of the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. The man was standing there, his eyes blazing with fury. "You can't leave," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not until I say so." I didn't stick around to find out what he meant. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my feet slipping on the rocky ground as I made my way down the cliffside. I could hear him behind me, shouting and cursing, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the bottom of the cliff and kept running, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I found a police station and told them what had happened, and they promised to send someone out to investigate. I spent the rest of the night in a hotel room, unable to sleep for fear that the man would find me. But when morning came, there was still no sign of him. The police searched the area but found no trace of the man or his campsite. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I never went camping alone again, and I always made sure to tell someone where I was going and when I expected to be back. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the terror of that night, alone on a cliffside in Wales, with a madman on the loose. I was traveling through Arizona in my RV, enjoying the open road and the desert scenery. I had been driving for hours, taking in the vast landscape, when I saw them, a young couple on the side of the road, waving frantically. I hesitated but decided to stop. They looked desperate, and it was a scorching hot day. The guy, maybe in his mid-20s, approached first. He had short, messy hair and was wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans. The girl was right behind him, clutching a backpack. She had long, blonde hair and looked exhausted. "Hey, man, our car broke down a few miles back. Can you give us a ride to the next town?" the guy asked. I felt a pang of sympathy. "Sure, hop in. It's not far from here." They thanked me and climbed into the RV. As I started driving, they introduced themselves as Jake and Lisa. They seemed friendly enough, though a bit on edge. I tried to make small talk, asking where they were headed. "Just trying to get to Flagstaff," Jake said, glancing at Lisa. "We have friends there." As we drove, I noticed Jake kept checking the rearview mirror, and Lisa seemed restless. Something felt off, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they were just stressed from being stranded. After about half an hour, we reached a small gas station. "Mind if we stop here for a bit?" Jake asked. "We could use a bathroom break." "Sure," I said, pulling in. We all got out, and while they headed inside, I filled up the tank. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When they came back, they were whispering to each other, looking around nervously. We got back on the road, and that's when things took a turn. Jake suddenly pulled out a gun. "Keep driving," he ordered. My heart started pounding. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. "Just keep calm," Lisa said, trying to soothe me. "We need your help, and you won't get hurt if you cooperate." Jake explained that they were on the run. They had stolen some money and were trying to get away from the police. My mind raced. I was trapped in my own RV with two fugitives. "Why me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your RV is perfect for staying off the radar," Jake said. "We just need to get to Flagstaff, and then we'll be out of your hair." I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I had to stay calm and think. They were desperate, which made them dangerous. I needed to find a way out of this without getting hurt. As we drove, Jake kept the gun pointed at me while Lisa rummaged through their backpack. She pulled out a map and spread it on the table. "Take this route," she said, pointing. "It avoids the main highways." I followed her directions, the tension in the RV thickening with every mile. We drove for what felt like hours, the sun setting and casting long shadows across the desert. I kept thinking about my options. Maybe I could signal for help at the next gas station or rest stop. We stopped again at a remote gas station. Jake made me go inside with him while Lisa stayed in the RV. Inside, I saw a payphone. It was my chance. While Jake was distracted, I quickly dialed 911 and whispered our location, hoping the operator heard me before Jake noticed. We got back on the road, and I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe help was on the way. As night fell, Jake's paranoia grew. He kept looking out the windows, muttering about the police catching up to them. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. Jake panicked. "They're onto us," he shouted. He made me pull off the road and into a secluded area. The headlights got closer, and I realized it was a police car. Jake freaked out, grabbing Lisa and dragging her outside. I followed, trying to stay calm. The police car stopped, and an officer stepped out, his hand on his holster. "Everything okay here?" he asked, eyeing us suspiciously. "Yes, officer," I said, trying to sound calm. "Just had some engine trouble." Jake tightened his grip on Lisa, the gun still in his hand. The officer noticed and drew his weapon. "Drop the gun," he ordered. Jake hesitated, then aimed the gun at the officer. A shot rang out, and everything went chaotic. The officer fired back, hitting Jake in the shoulder. Lisa screamed and ran towards me, and I pulled her behind the RV for cover. More police cars arrived, their sirens blaring. Officers surrounded us, shouting commands. Jake was on the ground, bleeding and disarmed. Lisa was sobbing, her face pale with fear. The police quickly secured the scene, handcuffing Jake and taking Lisa into custody. An officer checked on me, making sure I was unarmed. I was shaken but relieved. It was over. They took my statement, and I learned that the couple had been on a crime spree across several states. The police had been on their trail, and my 911 call had helped them locate us. I watched as the police cars drove away, taking Jake and Lisa with them. I was left standing in the quiet desert, my RV parked nearby. The fear and tension slowly drained away, replaced by exhaustion. I got back into the RV and drove to the nearest town, finding a motel to spend the night. As I lay in bed, I replayed the events in my mind, still in disbelief. I had survived a harrowing encounter, one that could have ended much worse. The next morning, I continued my trip, grateful to be safe. The open road seemed less inviting now, but I was determined to move forward. It was pouring rain, the kind that makes it hard to see even a few feet ahead. I was driving through the middle of nowhere in the Midwest, trying to get home after visiting my folks. The road was empty, not a car in sight, just endless fields on either side. The wipers were working overtime, but visibility was still terrible. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure by the side of the road, drenched and holding out a thumb. A hitchhiker. I never pick up hitchhikers, but something about the storm and the sheer desolation of the place made me stop. The guy looked harmless enough, maybe in his early 20s, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. I rolled down the window a bit and asked him where he was headed. He said he was trying to get to a town about 50 miles down the road. He seemed friendly, grateful even. So, I unlocked the door and let him in. He climbed into the passenger seat, thanking me profusely. We drove in silence for a while, the rain pounding on the roof. He introduced himself as Jake, said he was coming back from visiting his sick mother. I nodded, made small talk about the weather, the storm. He seemed normal, a bit quiet, but nothing out of the ordinary. About 20 minutes into the drive, things started to change. Jake shifted in his seat, looking around nervously. He asked if we could take a detour, said he needed to pick something up from a friend's place. I told him it was late, and I wanted to get home, but he insisted. His voice had a new edge to it, almost demanding. I tried to brush it off, saying I didn't have time for detours. That's when he snapped. His friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, hard look. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a knife, holding it close to his side where I could see it but not easily reach it. "You're gonna drive where I tell you," he said, his voice low and threatening. My heart started pounding. This wasn't the friendly guy I had picked up. This was someone dangerous. I nodded, trying to keep calm. "All right, where do you need to go?" I asked, my voice shaking. He gave me directions, telling me to take a series of turns that led us off the main road and onto a smaller, dirt path. The road was rough, and the rain was making it worse. We drove for what felt like an eternity, the silence in the car heavy and tense. I kept glancing at him, trying to figure out a way out of this. The knife never left his hand, and his eyes were fixed on me, making sure I didn't try anything. Finally, we reached a clearing in the woods. There was an old, abandoned barn in the middle of the clearing. He told me to stop the car and get out. I did as he said, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. The barn looked like it hadn't been used in years, and there was no sign of anyone else around. He got out too, walking around to my side, the knife still in his hand. "We're gonna go inside," he said, nodding towards the barn. I had no choice but to follow. The rain was still coming down hard, making everything slippery and cold. Inside the barn, it was dark and smelled of damp and rot. Jake told me to sit down on an old crate while he rummaged through his backpack. I took the chance to look around, hoping for something I could use to defend myself. There was nothing, just old, broken tools and piles of hay. He pulled out some rope from his bag and tossed it to me. "Tie your feet," he ordered, pointing the knife at me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it, but I did as he said. He came over and checked the knots, then tied my hands behind my back. I asked him why he was doing this, trying to keep him talking, hoping to buy some time. He just smiled, a twisted, cold smile that sent chills down my spine. He didn't answer, just paced back and forth, occasionally glancing out the barn door. Minutes felt like hours. I tried to think of a way to escape, but with my hands and feet tied, there wasn't much I could do. The rain was still pounding outside, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Suddenly, he walked over to me and leaned in close, the knife pressed against my throat. "We're gonna wait here until morning," he said. "And if you try anything, I'll make sure you regret it." His breath was hot against my face, and I could see the madness in his eyes. I nodded, too scared to speak. He backed off, settling down on another crate, keeping the knife in his hand. I sat there, soaked and terrified, trying to figure out how I could get out of this alive. Hours passed, and he eventually dozed off, the knife slipping from his hand. I saw my chance. Slowly, I worked at the knots around my wrists, praying he wouldn't wake up. It took forever, but finally, I managed to free my hands. I looked around, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon. I found a rusty old pitchfork leaning against the wall. Quietly, I grabbed it, my heart pounding in my chest. I inched closer to him, the pitchfork raised, ready to strike. But just as I was about to make my move, he stirred and opened his eyes. He saw the pitchfork and lunged at me, but I was faster. I swung it with all my strength, hitting him in the shoulder. He screamed in pain, dropping the knife. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, my legs barely holding me up, out into the rain and towards my car. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open and jumping inside. I started the engine and tore out of there, the headlights barely cutting through the storm. I drove for miles, not daring to look back. Eventually, I found a gas station and called the police. They went to the barn, but by the time they got there, Jake was gone. They never found him, and I never heard anything more about him. I still have nightmares about that night, the rain, and the look in his eyes. I've never picked up another hitchhiker, and I never will. I worked as a receptionist at a small hotel, a quiet place on the edge of town. Most nights were uneventful, with few guests and nothing much happening. That changed when the guest in room 213 checked in. The man seemed ordinary enough, checked in late at night, didn't say much. He paid for a week up front, then took his key and went to his room. I didn't think much of it at first. We had guests like him all the time. After a few days, I realized I hadn't seen him since he checked in. Normally, guests would come and go, at least leave the room for meals or a walk. But room 213 was silent, no sound, no movement. It started to bother me. I checked the computer and saw that his key card hadn't been used to leave or enter the room since the night he arrived. I thought maybe he was just keeping to himself, but it still seemed strange. On the fourth day, I decided to check on him. I knocked on the door of room 213, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I considered using the master key, but I didn't want to invade his privacy. I went back to the front desk, still feeling uneasy. Later that night, I noticed something even stranger. The lock record showed the door to room 213 had been opened several times during the past few days, but not by the guest's key card. It was opened by the master key, the one only staff had access to. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been entering room 213, but it wasn't the guest. I decided to wait until my shift ended and then go check the room myself. At the end of my shift, I grabbed the master key and headed up to the second floor. The hallway was silent, the dim lights flickering slightly. I reached room 213 and took a deep breath before unlocking the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. I fumbled for the light switch and turned it on. The bed was made, everything seemed normal at first glance. But then I noticed the closet door was slightly ajar. I walked over to the closet and pulled the door open. Inside, I found a pile of clothes that didn't belong to the guest, men's and women's clothing, all mixed together. There was also a strange smell, like something rotten. My heart was pounding as I turned around to check the bathroom. The door was closed, and I could see a faint light coming from underneath. I knocked, but there was no response. I slowly pushed the door open and was hit by the stench of decay. The guest was there, lying in the bathtub, eyes wide open, but lifeless. His skin was pale, and he looked like he had been dead for days. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. That's when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw a man standing in the doorway. He wasn't a guest. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially hidden by a hood. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer. The man didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. I tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me into the room, slamming the door shut. I struggled, but he was too strong. He shoved me against the wall, his hand over my mouth. "Stay quiet," he hissed, "or you'll end up like him." I nodded, too terrified to do anything else. He let go of me and started searching the room, pulling out drawers, tossing things around. I didn't know what he was looking for, but I knew I had to get out of there. I waited until he was distracted, then made a dash for the door. I managed to unlock it and ran down the hallway, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was outside, in the parking lot, gasping for breath. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the room and found the man hiding in the closet. He was arrested, and the police later told me he was wanted for multiple murders. The guest in room 213 had been one of his victims. I never went back to that hotel. I couldn't. The memory of that night still haunts me, the feeling of being watched, the smell of death, the cold eyes of a killer. I'll never forget it, and I hope no one else ever has to go through something like that. I was out in this remote valley, just trying to get some dope shots of nature for my photography gig. It was already getting dark, but I was all about that golden hour vibe, you feel me? So, I'm setting up my gear, getting ready to capture some epic sunset shots, when I see these weird lights in the sky. At first, I'm thinking it's just some planes or something, but these lights, man, they were moving in ways planes ain't supposed to move. Zigzagging, hovering, all kinds of crazy stuff. I'm like, what the heck is going on? So, being the curious idiot that I am, I decide to follow them. I trek through the woods, following those lights deeper and deeper into the valley. The whole time, I'm feeling this weird mix of excitement and dread, like I know I shouldn't be messing with whatever this is, but I can't stop myself. Finally, after what feels like forever, I come to this clearing, and that's when I see it. A freaking secret government facility hidden in the mountains. I'm talking fences topped with razor wire, guards patrolling with guns, the whole 9 yards. Now, I'm freaking out, right? Like, I'm just a nature photographer trying to get some cool shots, and here I am stumbling onto some top secret government stuff. But at the same time, I gotta know what's going on. So, I start sneaking closer, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. And that's when I see them bringing in these crates, big metal ones, like something out of a sci-fi movie. And the guards, man, they're armed to the teeth, looking all serious and stuff. I'm thinking maybe I should just turn around and hightail it out of there, but then I hear this voice behind me. Freeze. Don't move. I spin around, and there's this guard aiming his gun right at me. My heart's pounding so hard I can barely breathe. He starts yelling at me, asking me what I'm doing there, who I am, all that stuff. I'm stuttering and stammering, trying to come up with some excuse, but before I know it, they've got me handcuffed and thrown in the back of a van. Next thing I know, I'm being interrogated by these government guys, asking me a bunch of questions about what I saw, who I told, all that jazz. I'm trying to play it cool, but inside, I'm freaking out. They keep me locked up for what feels like forever, grilling me about every little detail. And then, just when I'm about to lose my mind, they let me go. No explanation, no apology, nothing. I stumble out of that facility, feeling like I just stepped into the twilight zone. And the whole way home, I'm thinking about those lights, those crates, and wondering what the heck I stumbled onto out there in the woods. But one thing's for sure, I ain't going back there anytime soon. Working as a security guard at the warehouse was usually uneventful. My shifts were long and mostly quiet, but I liked the solitude. It was a huge place, filled with rows of crates and boxes stacked high. I'd walk the aisles, making sure everything was secure. Most nights, nothing happened. One night, I was patrolling the north section, which was supposed to be empty. It was a new part of the warehouse that wasn't in use yet. I walked down the long, dimly lit aisle, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was comforting, a break from the usual hum of machinery. As I reached the far end, I heard a faint noise. It was like a soft thud, followed by muffled voices. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The noises were coming from behind a stack of crates. My first thought was that it might be some animals that got in, but the voices were unmistakably human. I felt a chill run down my spine. This area was supposed to be empty. No one was allowed back here. I radioed in, but the static on the other end told me I was out of range. I decided to check it out myself before raising the alarm. I crept closer, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I rounded the corner, I saw a faint light spilling out from behind a stack of crates. I moved slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I peeked around the crates, I saw them. There were 5 men, all armed. They had set up a small camp with laptops and equipment that looked expensive. They were talking in hushed tones, focused on their screens. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear they were up to something illegal. I backed away slowly, trying to stay out of sight. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I needed to get out of there and call for help. As I turned to leave, my foot hit a loose piece of metal, and it clanged loudly against the concrete floor. The men looked up instantly, their eyes scanning the darkness. I froze, hoping they hadn't seen me. One of them barked an order, and 2 of the men started moving towards me, their guns drawn. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. I could hear them behind me, shouting for me to stop. I took a sharp turn and ducked behind a stack of boxes, trying to catch my breath. I needed to find a way out before they caught up to me. I looked around, my mind racing. There was a side door not too far from where I was hiding. If I could make it there, I might be able to get out and call for help. I peeked out from behind the boxes, seeing the men searching the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I waited until they moved further down the aisle before making a break for the door. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the door and pushed it open, slipping outside into the cold night air. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation. They assured me that help was on the way. I stayed outside, hidden in the shadows, waiting. It felt like an eternity before I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. I saw the red and blue lights flashing as the police cars pulled up. The officers got out and moved into the warehouse, their guns drawn. I stayed hidden, watching as they went in. It wasn't long before they came back out with the men in handcuffs. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling the tension drain from my body. One of the officers came over to me, asking if I was all right. I nodded, still shaken but grateful they had arrived. I explained what had happened, and they took my statement. They told me that the men were part of a smuggling ring and had been using the warehouse as a base of operations. They had been looking for them for a while. I thanked the officers and watched as they took the men away. I knew it would be a long night of paperwork and questions, but I was just glad it was over. The warehouse felt different now, less safe. I knew I would never forget what happened that night. It was just another routine night at the airport. I was part of the ground crew, responsible for loading and unloading cargo from the planes that came and went throughout the day and night. But that night, things took a terrifying turn that I never saw coming. As I was doing my rounds, I noticed something strange out on the tarmac. There was a plane parked in one of the remote stands, its cargo hold open and empty. But what caught my attention was the figure lurking around the plane, fiddling with something inside. At first, I thought it might be one of my colleagues, but as I got closer, I realized that it was someone else entirely. Someone who didn't belong there. I approached cautiously, trying not to make any noise as I crept closer to get a better look. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were several men inside the cargo hold, loading boxes onto the plane. But these weren't just any boxes. They were filled with contraband, illegal goods that were being smuggled in and out of the country. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that confronting these men could be dangerous. They were armed and clearly not afraid to use force to get what they wanted. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing while they broke the law right under my nose. I had to act, and I had to act fast. I took a deep breath and stepped out from my hiding spot, confronting the men and demanding to know what they were doing. At first, they were taken aback, surprised to see me there. But their surprise quickly turned to anger as they realized that I had caught them in the act. They tried to intimidate me, threatening me with violence if I didn't leave them alone. But I stood my ground, refusing to back down. That's when things took a turn for the worse. One of the men lunged at me, grabbing me by the collar and pinning me against the side of the plane. I struggled against him, trying to break free, but he was too strong. I could feel the panic rising inside me as I realized that I was completely at their mercy. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. It was the airport security team, responding to my distress call. The smugglers released me and tried to make a run for it, but they were quickly apprehended by the security team. As they were led away in handcuffs, I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be alive. I was driving through a small town in Oregon on a stormy night, trying to get home. The rain was pouring down, making it hard to see. The road was deserted, and I was exhausted from a long day at work. I just wanted to get home and crawl into bed. I decided to take a shortcut through a desolate road I hadn't used before. It was supposed to save me at least 15 minutes. I knew it wasn't the best idea, given the weather, but I was tired and wanted to get home quickly. As I drove down the dark, empty road, I felt uneasy. The rain was coming down so hard that my wipers could barely keep up. I turned up the radio to distract myself, but it didn't help much. Suddenly, I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. It looked like a police car. My heart started to race. I wasn't speeding or doing anything wrong, so I couldn't figure out why I was being pulled over. I slowed down and pulled to the side of the road. The car behind me stopped, and a man in a police uniform got out. He walked up to my window, and I rolled it down just a crack. The rain was pouring in, and I could barely see his face. "License and registration, please," he said, his voice calm but firm. I fumbled with my purse, trying to find my wallet. My hands were shaking, and I dropped my wallet on the floor. I picked it up and handed him my license and registration. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "No, sir," I replied, my voice trembling. I wasn't speeding or anything. He looked at my license and then back at me. "Your taillight is out," he said. "I need you to step out of the car." I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The man's uniform looked strange, and his car didn't have the usual markings of a police car. But I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I slowly opened my door and stepped out into the rain. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "Come with me," he said, pulling me towards his car. "Wait, what's going on?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Just come with me," he repeated, his voice cold and menacing. I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. He dragged me to his car and shoved me into the back seat. I felt a surge of fear as he slammed the door shut and got into the driver's seat. "Please, let me go," I begged, my voice shaking. "I haven't done anything wrong." He ignored me and started driving. The rain was pounding on the roof, and the road was slick and treacherous. I looked around, trying to find a way to escape. The doors were locked, and the windows were too small to crawl through. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied, his eyes cold and empty. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I looked around the car, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing. As we drove deeper into the forest, the road became more and more desolate. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The rain was relentless, pounding on the roof and windows. Finally, he pulled off the road and stopped the car. He got out and opened my door, grabbing my arm and pulling me out into the rain. "Please, don't do this," I begged, my voice shaking. "Just let me go." He ignored me and dragged me into the forest. The ground was muddy, and I stumbled as he pulled me along. The trees were thick and close together, blocking out the light. I could barely see where I was going. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing. He shoved me to the ground and stood over me, his eyes cold and calculating. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a knife and held it to my throat. I felt a surge of panic, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please, don't do this," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Just let me go." He smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "No one's going to find you out here," he said. "No one's going to hear you scream." I felt a surge of terror. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I looked around, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. There was nothing. Suddenly, I remembered the pepper spray in my purse. I reached for it, trying to be as discreet as possible. My hand closed around the small canister, and I pulled it out. Before he could react, I sprayed the pepper spray in his face. He screamed and dropped the knife, clutching at his eyes. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. The forest was thick and dark, and I stumbled over roots and branches as I ran. The rain was pouring down, making it hard to see. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I ran faster, my lungs burning and my legs aching. I had to get away. Finally, I saw a light in the distance. I ran towards it, hoping it was a house or a road. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. I ran up to the door and pounded on it, screaming for help. The door opened, and an older man stood there, looking confused and concerned. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. "Please, help me," I gasped. "A man is trying to kill me." He looked over my shoulder and saw the man stumbling through the forest, clutching his eyes. "Get inside," he said, pulling me into the cabin and locking the door. We called the police, and they arrived a short time later. They arrested the man and took him away. I was safe, but I knew I would never forget the terror I felt that night. As I sat in the cabin, wrapped in a blanket and sipping a cup of tea, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe. I had survived. I was driving through New Mexico late at night, the highway stretching out endlessly before me. The road was deserted, just me and the occasional tumbleweed. I had been driving for hours, my only company the radio and the hum of my car's engine. The loneliness of the highway was both comforting and eerie. It was around midnight when I first noticed the van. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another vehicle on this lonely stretch of road. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the van was staying behind me, matching my speed. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe the driver was just heading in the same direction. After another 10 minutes, the van started to get closer. It was subtle at first, just inching forward, but then it sped up, tailgating me aggressively. My heart rate picked up. I tried to stay calm and decided to speed up a bit, putting some distance between us. For a while, it worked. The van fell back, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Then, out of nowhere, the van sped up again, swerving into the lane next to me. It veered dangerously close to my car, almost forcing me off the road. Panic set in. I honked my horn, hoping the driver would back off, but it only seemed to provoke them. The van pulled back for a moment, then sped up and tried to force me off the road again. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. My mind was racing. Why was this happening? I pressed harder on the gas pedal, speeding down the highway. The van matched my speed, sticking close to my bumper. It was a game of cat and mouse, and I was the mouse. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the van's headlights glaring back at me. The driver was relentless. I spotted an exit up ahead and decided to take it, hoping to lose the van on the smaller roads. I swerved onto the exit ramp, my tires screeching. The van followed. The exit led to a narrow, winding road. Trees loomed on either side, casting long shadows in my headlights. I sped down the road, the van still behind me. I needed a plan. I couldn't keep driving like this forever. My mind raced with possibilities, but nothing seemed safe. Suddenly, the van accelerated and rammed into the back of my car. My vehicle lurched forward, and I struggled to keep control. The van hit me again, harder this time. I swerved, my car skidding on the pavement. I saw a small dirt road up ahead and took a sharp turn onto it, hoping the van wouldn't be able to follow as easily. The dirt road was rough and bumpy, my car bouncing over rocks and potholes. The van followed, its headlights bobbing in my rearview mirror. I could feel my pulse in my throat, fear gripping me tightly. I couldn't keep this up much longer. Then, I saw it, an old, abandoned gas station just off the road. It was a long shot, but I had no other options. I sped toward it, skidding to a halt in front of the dark building. I jumped out of my car and ran inside, hoping to find a place to hide. The gas station was musty and dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through broken windows. I found a back room and hid behind a dusty shelf, trying to quiet my breathing. I could hear the van's engine outside, followed by the sound of a door slamming. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. The footsteps entered the gas station, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound of glass crunching underfoot sent shivers down my spine. The person was getting closer. I closed my eyes, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps stopped just outside the room where I was hiding. I could hear the person breathing, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. They stood there for what felt like an eternity before moving on. I waited, counting the seconds, until I was sure they were gone. Slowly, I emerged from my hiding spot, creeping towards the front of the gas station. I peered through a crack in the wall and saw the van still parked outside. The driver was nowhere to be seen. My car was a few yards away, and I knew I had to make a run for it. I took a deep breath and bolted for my car. My feet pounded on the gravel, and I threw open the door, jumping inside. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed out of the lot. Just as I thought I was in the clear, the van roared to life. It came barreling toward me, but I didn't look back. I sped down the dirt road, heading back to the highway. The van followed, but I was determined to get away. I reached the main road and floored it, my car's engine straining. The van was still behind me, but I saw headlights in the distance, another vehicle. I honked my horn and flashed my lights, trying to get their attention. The other car slowed down, and I sped past them. The van hesitated for a moment before turning off down a side road, disappearing into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I pulled into a well-lit gas station, my hands still shaking. I called the police and reported everything, but I knew they wouldn't find the van or its driver. I sat in my car, trying to calm down, grateful to be alive. The memory of that night still haunts me. I can't drive down a lonely highway without looking over my shoulder, fearing the van will reappear. I don't know who the driver was or why they targeted me, but I'm just thankful I managed to escape. I travel a lot for work. It was supposed to be just another trip, another night in another hotel. This time I was in a city I hadn't visited before. The hotel was one of those mid-range places, nothing fancy, but decent enough. I checked in late, around 10 p.m., after a long day of meetings and flights. I was exhausted. I got to my room on the third floor, unpacked a few things, and decided to take a quick shower. The room was typical: a bed, a desk, a TV, and a small bathroom. Everything seemed fine, but I had this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just tired. After my shower, I changed into pajamas and started to unwind. I noticed the curtains were slightly open, so I went to close them. As I did, I glanced out and saw a man in the room across the courtyard, on the same floor, standing by his window. He was staring right at me. I quickly closed the curtains, feeling uneasy but trying to convince myself it was nothing. I turned on the TV and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance at the window, half expecting to see him again. I decided to double-check the door lock. It was secure, but I put the chain on too, just to be sure. I tried to distract myself with some work, but my mind kept wandering back to that man. I didn't see him clearly, just his silhouette, but the way he was staring felt wrong. I told myself I was overreacting and forced myself to focus on my work. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV and got into bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every noise seemed amplified, every creak and groan of the building made my heart race. After what felt like hours, I finally started to drift off. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. I didn't know why at first, then I heard it, the sound of someone trying to open my door. The handle rattled softly, then more forcefully. I froze, my mind racing. The chain held, but the door shook as the person outside tried harder to get in. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. My voice was shaking as I told them someone was trying to break into my room. The person on the other end said they'd send someone up immediately. The rattling stopped, and I heard footsteps walking away. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I peeked through the peephole and saw a hotel employee. I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on, and explained what had happened. The employee looked concerned and said they checked the security footage. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound made me jump. Around 6 a.m., I got up, packed my things, and went down to the front desk to check out. The manager was there and apologized profusely. They said they reviewed the footage and saw a man trying to get into my room, but they couldn't identify him. They offered me a refund and a different room for the rest of my stay, but I declined. I decided to cut my trip short and head home. I didn't feel safe there anymore. As I waited for my taxi, I saw the man again. He was sitting in the lobby, staring at me. Our eyes met, and he gave me a chilling smile. I got out of there as fast as I could. The ride to the airport was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. Even on the plane, I couldn't relax until we were in the air. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. When I finally got home, I locked all my doors and windows and called my boss to explain why I cut the trip short. They were understanding and more concerned about my safety than anything else. That night, I slept with the lights on. It's been a few weeks since then, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I check into a hotel now, I make sure to double lock the door and keep my phone within reach. I haven't seen that man again, but the memory of his stare haunts me. I'm more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings. It's a lesson I wish I didn't have to learn the hard way. It was a bitterly cold night in the Rockies, and I was out camping with my friends, seeking adventure in the rugged wilderness. We had chosen a remote spot, far from the beaten path, where we could truly experience the beauty and solitude of nature. But as the night wore on, a fierce snowstorm descended upon us, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of snow and ice. We were snowbound, trapped in our tents with no way of knowing when the storm would let up and allow us to continue our journey. As we huddled together for warmth, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow caught our attention. We peered out of our tents and saw a man approaching our campsite, his face obscured by the falling snow. He claimed to be lost, saying that he had been hiking in the mountains when the storm hit and he had become disoriented. His story seemed plausible enough, but there was something about him that set off alarm bells in my mind. His eyes were cold and calculating, and his movements were deliberate and controlled. He didn't seem like someone who was genuinely lost, he seemed like someone who had a hidden agenda. I exchanged worried glances with my friends, silently communicating our growing unease. We didn't know what this man was capable of, and we didn't want to find out the hard way. We offered him some food and water, hoping to be hospitable and diffuse the tension. But as he ate, he started asking us strange questions about our supplies, our weapons, and whether we were alone out here in the wilderness. I felt a chill run down my spine. This guy wasn't just lost, he was sizing us up, trying to figure out if we were an easy target. Before we could react, the man's demeanor changed. His friendly facade slipped away, revealing the true menace beneath. He lunged at us, his eyes filled with malice, and we knew that we were in serious trouble. We scrambled to our feet, ready to defend ourselves against this unexpected threat. But the man was faster and stronger than we had anticipated, overpowering us with ease. I felt a surge of fear coursing through my veins as he advanced towards us, his intentions clear. He meant to do us harm, and there was nothing we could do to stop him. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a sudden noise echoed through the snow-covered landscape. It was the sound of approaching rescue, of salvation, of someone coming to save us from our terrifying predicament. We held our breath as the noise drew closer, praying that it wasn't too late, that help had arrived in time to save us from the clutches of this dangerous man. And then, emerging from the swirling snowstorm, came a group of park rangers, their faces grim and determined. They had been alerted to our situation by a passing hiker who had seen the commotion from a distance. With the arrival of the park rangers, the tables were turned. The man, realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, fled into the wilderness, disappearing into the night. We were safe. We were alive. And as we were escorted back to civilization by the park rangers, we breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to have escaped from our terrifying ordeal in the Rockies. I decided to go camping alone near an abandoned cabin in the Sierra Nevada. I had heard about the spot from a friend who said it was a great place to get away from everything. I packed my gear, left a note for my brother, and set out. The drive up was beautiful, the mountains rising up around me, the air getting cooler as I climbed higher. When I reached the area, I parked my car at the end of a dirt road and hiked a couple of miles to the cabin. It looked just like my friend had described: old, weathered wood, a sagging roof, and windows that were mostly broken. I set up my tent a little ways away, preferring the open space to the musty interior of the cabin. The first night was peaceful. The sounds of the forest were comforting, and the stars were incredibly bright. I had a small campfire going and roasted some hot dogs, feeling a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in a while. I went to bed early, looking forward to a day of exploring the next morning. When I woke up, I noticed something strange. There were footprints around my campsite that hadn't been there before. They were fresh, and definitely not mine. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone else on my hike up, and the idea that someone had been near my camp while I slept was unsettling. I decided to investigate the cabin. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, and I could figure out what was going on. As I approached the cabin, I heard voices. Peeking through a gap in the wall, I saw a group of people inside. They looked rough, like they had been living out here for a while. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and they had a makeshift camp set up inside the cabin. I backed away slowly, not wanting to draw attention to myself. But as I turned to leave, I stepped on a twig, and it snapped loudly. The voices inside the cabin went silent, and then I heard someone shout, "Who's out there?" Panic surged through me, and I took off running back towards my campsite. I reached my tent and started packing up as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone coming after me. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw one of the men from the cabin standing there, watching me. "Hey," he said, his voice low and menacing. "What are you doing out here?" "I was just leaving," I stammered, trying to sound calm. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You shouldn't have come here," he said, taking a step closer. "This is our place." I nodded, slinging my pack over my shoulder. "I'm sorry. I'll go now." But as I tried to walk past him, he grabbed my arm. "Not so fast," he said. "We need to make sure you don't tell anyone about us." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how much trouble I was in. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. The man called out, and two more men emerged from the trees. They surrounded me, and I knew I had to think fast. I decided to make a break for it. I shoved the man holding me as hard as I could and took off running. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, dodging through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept going. I stumbled upon a creek and followed it, hoping the water would cover my tracks. The noise of the water helped drown out their shouts, and I prayed they would lose my trail. After what felt like hours, the sounds of pursuit faded. I slowed down, exhausted and terrified. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I couldn't go back to my campsite. I needed to find help, but I was deep in the forest, miles from my car. As night fell, I found a spot to rest. I hid among some rocks, trying to stay out of sight. I didn't sleep much, too scared that they would find me. Every noise made me jump, but the night passed without incident. In the morning, I started moving again, keeping an eye out for any signs of the men. My legs were sore, and I was dehydrated, but I pushed on. Eventually, I found a trail that led me back towards the road where I had parked my car. When I finally saw my car in the distance, I almost cried with relief. I ran the last stretch, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition. I drove back to the nearest town as fast as I could and went straight to the police. I told them everything, but when they went to check the cabin, it was empty. The men were gone, leaving no trace behind. The police said it was likely a group of squatters, and they would keep an eye out, but I knew they were long gone. I still think about that trip often. The sense of vulnerability, the fear, and the realization that I was completely alone out there. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into a nightmare. Now, whenever I go camping, I make sure I'm never alone. It was late, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I could barely see the road through the windshield. My old car sputtered and stalled, the engine dying with a final, pathetic cough. I tried turning the key, but it was no use. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Northwest. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course. I sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I couldn't stay in the car all night. I needed help. I noticed a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the trees and rain. It looked like a farmhouse. Grabbing my jacket, I stepped out into the rain. It was cold, and the water soaked through my shoes and clothes in seconds. I started walking towards the light, hoping someone there could help me. The walk felt longer than it should have. The mud sucked at my feet, and the rain made it hard to see. Finally, I reached the farmhouse. It was old and a bit run down, but the lights were on. I knocked on the door, shivering. A man opened the door. He was tall and heavy-set, with a scruffy beard and a worn flannel shirt. He looked surprised to see me. "My car broke down," I said. "I need help. Can I use your phone?" He stared at me for a moment, then nodded. "Come on in. You'll catch your death out there." I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. The inside of the house was cluttered but cozy. There was a fire burning in the fireplace, and the smell of something cooking filled the air. "Sit by the fire," he said. "I'll get my wife. She can help you." I sat down, trying to stop shivering. A woman appeared from the kitchen. She was small and thin, with a kind face and gray hair pulled back in a bun. "Hello," she said. "I'm Martha. This is my husband, Tom. What brings you out here on a night like this?" I explained about my car breaking down and asked if I could use their phone. Martha smiled and shook her head. "We don't have a phone," she said. "But Tom can drive you to town in the morning. It's too dangerous to go out now." I felt a twinge of unease. Something about the situation didn't feel right, but I didn't have much choice. I was stuck here for the night. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate it." Tom nodded and offered me some tea. I took it, hoping it would warm me up. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled outside. The storm was getting worse. As we sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Tom kept glancing at me with a strange look in his eyes, and Martha seemed overly friendly. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just being paranoid. They showed me to a small guest room upstairs. It was simple but clean. I thanked them again and closed the door. The bed was old and creaky, but I was too tired to care. I lay down, hoping to get some sleep. A few hours later, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but it sounded like someone whispering. I listened, heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from the other side of the wall. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall. I could hear Tom and Martha talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Something about the tone of their voices made my skin crawl. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Panicking, I quickly got back into bed and pretended to be asleep. The door creaked open, and I could feel someone standing there, watching me. After what felt like an eternity, the door closed and the footsteps retreated. I knew I had to get out of there. Quietly, I got up and dressed. I tiptoed to the door and opened it just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty. I slipped out of the room and headed for the stairs. I made it to the bottom without making a sound. The front door was just a few steps away. I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to see Tom, his face twisted with anger. "Where do you think you're going?" he hissed. I need to leave," I stammered. "I don't feel well." "You're not going anywhere," he said, tightening his grip on my shoulder. "Martha, we have a problem." Martha appeared from the kitchen, a knife in her hand. She smiled, but it was no longer a kind smile. "We can't let you leave," she said. "Not now." I struggled, trying to break free, but Tom was too strong. He shoved me into a chair and tied my hands behind my back with a rough rope. Martha stood nearby, the knife glinting in the firelight. "Please, just let me go," I begged. "I won't tell anyone. I promise." Tom laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "It's too late for that," he said. "You shouldn't have come here." They left me there, tied to the chair, while they went into another room. I could hear them talking, but the words were muffled. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. After what felt like hours, they came back. Tom untied me and forced me to stand. "You're coming with us," he said. "Don't try anything, or you'll regret it." They marched me outside into the rain. The storm was still raging, and the cold wind cut through me like a knife. They led me to a small shed behind the house. Tom opened the door, and they shoved me inside. The shed was dark and smelled of damp earth. I could hear the rain pounding on the roof. Tom lit a lantern, casting a dim light over the room. There were tools and old farming equipment scattered around, but nothing I could use to defend myself. "Stay here," Tom said. "We'll be back in the morning." They left, locking the door behind them. I was alone in the dark, cold and scared. I had no idea what they planned to do with me, but I knew I had to escape. I spent the next few hours searching the shed for anything that could help me. Finally, I found a small, rusty saw. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I worked at the door, trying to saw through the old wood. It took forever, but eventually, I made a hole big enough to squeeze through. I slipped out into the night, the rain still pouring down. I ran, not caring about the mud and the cold. I just needed to get away. I didn't know where I was going, but I kept running until I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. It was a car, coming down the road. I stumbled towards it, waving my arms, hoping they would stop. The car pulled over, and a man got out. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking concerned. "No," I gasped. "Please, help me. They're after me." He helped me into the car and drove me to the nearest town. I told the police everything, but when they went to the farmhouse, Tom and Martha were gone. The house was empty, and there was no sign of them. I never found out what they were planning to do with me, and I never saw them again. I was driving through rural Georgia, rain pouring down so hard I could barely see the road ahead. My windshield wipers were on full speed, but it didn't help much. I was tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was to reach my motel and get some rest. Up ahead, I saw a car on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. A woman stood next to it, waving her arms frantically. She looked drenched and desperate. I hesitated for a moment, but then I decided to pull over. It didn't feel right to leave her out there in the storm. I rolled down my window a crack. "Do you need help?" I shouted over the sound of the rain. "Yes, please," she called back. "My car won't start. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" I nodded and unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in, dripping water all over the seat. I noticed she was shivering, and her clothes were soaked through. I felt a pang of sympathy. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been out there for almost an hour." "No problem," I replied, trying to be reassuring. "Where's the nearest gas station?" "Just a few miles down the road," she said. "It's not far." I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. The rain was relentless, hammering against the roof and windows. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension in the car palpable. Suddenly, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. A dark figure appeared from the shadows, running towards my car. I barely had time to react before the back door was yanked open, and a man climbed in, brandishing a gun. "Don't move," he snarled, pointing the weapon at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at him, fear gripping me. "Keep driving," the woman ordered, her tone now cold and commanding. "Do exactly as we say, and you won't get hurt." I nodded, my hand shaking on the wheel. I felt trapped, panic rising as I realized I had fallen into a trap. They had planned this, using the woman as bait. "Where do you want me to go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Turn left up ahead," the man instructed. "There's a dirt road. Take it." I did as I was told, my mind racing. I had to find a way out of this. The dirt road was muddy and slick, making it hard to keep control of the car. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. "Stop here," the woman said abruptly. I brought the car to a halt, my heart pounding. The man kept the gun trained on me as the woman got out, motioning for me to follow. "Get out," she commanded. I slowly opened my door and stepped into the rain, the mud sucking at my shoes. They led me to a small clearing, where two more men were waiting by an old, beat-up van. "Hand over your keys," the man with the gun ordered. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling them out and tossing them to him. He caught them and handed them to one of the other men. "Take his car," he said. "We'll deal with him here." Panic surged through me. I knew I had to act fast. As they turned towards the van, I made a split-second decision. I bolted, sprinting into the trees. Shouts erupted behind me, and I heard the sound of footsteps chasing after me. The forest was dense, branches scratching at my face and clothes as I ran. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the rain making everything slippery. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear them behind me, getting closer. I spotted a large fallen tree up ahead and dove behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I heard them cursing, their voices angry and frustrated. "Spread out," one of them shouted. "He can't have gone far." I stayed as still as possible, praying they wouldn't find me. I could hear them moving through the forest, searching. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I needed a plan. I noticed a small creek nearby, its water rushing from the rain. An idea formed in my mind. If I could follow the creek, maybe I could lose them and find my way back to the road. I waited until their voices faded a bit, then carefully crept towards the water. I moved as quietly as I could, the sound of the creek covering my footsteps. The cold water soaked through my shoes, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I followed the creek for what felt like an eternity, my senses on high alert for any sign of my pursuers. Finally, I saw a break in the trees up ahead. I picked up the pace, hoping it was the road. As I emerged from the forest, relief washed over me. The road was just a few yards away. I scrambled up the embankment and onto the pavement, looking around frantically. There was no sign of the carjackers. I started running down the road, not sure where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between myself and them as possible. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights approaching. I waved my arms, praying it was someone who could help. The car slowed down and stopped beside me. An older man rolled down the window, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Please," I gasped. "I need help. I was attacked." "Get in," he said, unlocking the door. "I'll take you to the nearest police station." I climbed into the car, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back, half expecting to see the carjackers emerge from the darkness. But the road remained empty. At the police station, I told them everything. They took my statement and assured me they would search for the criminals. I knew it would be difficult to catch them, but I was grateful to be safe. That night, as I lay in a cheap motel room, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing everything. The rain still pounded against the window, a reminder of the terrifying encounter I had survived.